Okay, so we're back on YouTube. All right, well, let's go ahead. We've got a forum here. We'll go ahead and call the meeting back to order. Like I said, Representative Duncan just had to step out for a few minutes. She'll be back taking care of some business. So next on our agenda, we're running a little bit late, but we had requested early on, I thought would be good for our first meeting, even though this is, I guess, maybe technically our second set of meetings. But to get an update from DEQ, and you know, I realize we'll have a couple other things maybe later in the last part of the session, but just the municipal solid waste program and update funding, how we're doing with that, and then also the orphan sites. And we did something a few years ago, years run by, on diverting some of the LUS funds over to help with that. And then another issue that a lot of folks on this committee are not familiar with, and that's the abandoned mineland funds, and how that program kind of works, where that program is right now, what we're doing with those dollars. And so just an update in that vein. We used to do this a little more regularly than we have last few years. So Director Parfit, I see you and Mr. Esch there. So I will be quiet and turn everything over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And yeah, Todd Parfit, Director of the Department of Environmental Quality. And we promise to keep you on your new schedule.
Thank you.
So yeah, as you stated, Mr. Chairman, we're going to provide some updates and reports that we've done in the past, talk about some of the funding associated with the programs. Also, in addition to the solid and hazardous waste and AML, we also had planned on providing some updates on air quality, because there are some important topics that I think you'll want to hear about in terms of funding for the new source review program, and then the major facilities, the Title V program. So we'll be doing that as well. And we'll do it in the order of solid and hazardous waste first, air quality, and then the abandoned mine lands program. So those folks will join us here after a bit. So we're going to start out by talking about the storage tank program, the corrective action count, how that works, the landfill remediation program and cease and transfer, which you heard a little bit about yesterday, and then orphan sites, and then the funding status and potential for accelerated contract work. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Ash. He's the administrator for the Solid and Hazardous Waste Division.
Okay, so from thank you, Director, and also thank you. I think I had asked that question back in session about how Title V funding was going to go. So good to get an update on that. Are we going to screen share your PowerPoints? Is that how we intend to do this?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we're going to share our screen now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, it currently says that the host has disabled the screen sharing.
Mr. Chairman, I'll fix that right now. Just if you give me just 1 second.
Yeah, I'm supposed to be able to do it, but I don't know how to do it. So we let you know. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, we can get Co to do that.
That's the old dog, right?
Yep.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
Chairman, that should be fixed now.
Yep, I can see it. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Ash.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Luke Esch. I'm the administrator of the Solid and Hazardous Waste Division with the Department of Environmental Quality. And we're just going to give you a few updates on some of where we're at with our programs. And we'll just dive right in. So starting with the storage tank program, the state has been administering the underground storage tank program since 1991. This is a very important program that the state took over from the federal government back in the 90s, that provides funding for remediating contaminated sites around the state from underground storage tanks. we do that through the corrective action account, which was created under the program. And another aspect of the program is the financial responsibility account. Now, the financial responsibility account is a federally mandated part of the underground storage tank program that requires operators to have insurance for third-party harm from underground storage tanks leaking. This can be a difficult insurance to obtain, so the state stepped in and took that role on to help a lot of the mom and pop operators be able to have that insurance and operate gas stations throughout the rural parts of the state. So it was a vital part of the program. In summary, we know we've had 1,635 storage tank sites, contaminated sites in the state. We've cleaned up 1,306 of these. We've got 329 remaining. Of those, 323 are currently in remediation projects, and 4 of the remaining 6 are going to be put in project this next year. You might be asking what the other 2 are doing. One is underlying the Dave Johnson power plant, so we really can't get to it till the power plant decommissions. And the other one is located in a contaminated site outside of Graybull. So we're going to wait till remediation gets cleaned up on those projects, and then we can go in and get those tanks. A little bit about the corrective action account. So the corrective action account is funded through a mineral severance tax, which is equivalent to 1 cent per gallon of fuel sold in the state. So that approximately equates to about $10 million a year. So part of those funds go to make sure that our financial responsibility account maintains an adequate balance, and the rest goes into the corrective action account. We currently have about $6.5 million in the corrective action account. And just a side note, the corrective action account also receives some funds from tank and contaminated site fees. So if you own a regulated tank or you have a contaminated site, you're required to pay a couple $100s a year to the corrective action account. This is a little bit.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Rothfuss, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure everyone's familiar with, if you could go back to the previous slide, which is kind of there, the equivalent to 1 cent per gallon of fuel sold. I think it's important for everyone to understand why it's coming from the mineral severance tax, how that works. Anyone who hasn't been on the committee for a while might not be familiar with that process. So if you could just hit that briefly for everyone's edification, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yep, good idea.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, that constitutionally, the 1 cent per gallon gas tax has to go to the Department of Transportation. So it was set up that it was equivalent to a 1 cent per gallon of fuel sold within the state coming from the mineral severance account. So that is kind of how they got around that constitutional issue, Mr. Senator Rothfuss. Moving on to a little bit more detail about the corrective action account. This is kind of how it plays out in reality. So the mineral severance tax comes into the corrective action account. We currently, the account balance is 6.5 million. You'll see those other numbers up there. That is because there's a outstanding obligation to pay back loans taken from the State Lands Clean Water Revolving Fund for the remediation activities we perform under the program. So we request a loan from that, from the Clean Water Revolving Fund program to conduct remediation. We get that loan from the state lands, the revolving fund, and that becomes an obligation that the department has to pay to state lands at some point. You'll also see that there's some lines going to the landfill remediation account and the orphan site program down here. So these were some modifications made in 2015 and I believe 2018 that allowed some funds from the corrective action account to be used for the landfill remediation program and the orphan site program, which I will get into later.
Okay, Representative Furphy had his hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just curious, why we don't pay the loan off? Are we paying any interest on that loan?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Furphy, it is my understanding we are not paying interest on that. If the State Lands Department called us up today and requested that to be paid out, we could certainly do that. It's my understanding that it's some accounting measures that they have with EPA to keep that balance where it's at so they can keep receiving funds under that various fund.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Moving on to landfill remediation. So in 2013, the legislature created the landfill remediation program to respond to groundwater contamination at our municipal landfills throughout the state. So under this program, DEQ works with the operators to fund up to 75% of the cost of addressing contamination at landfills for up to 10 years. We did some, and there's a long history to this program, as Chairman Greer and Senator Coe and Rothfuss would probably agree with. But back in 2010, there was a report put together that estimated the total cost of remediation of all our contaminated landfills was $226 million. We are currently working with a lot of the top 5 landfills on the priority list to conduct remediation. But the current cost of the 11 highest priority right now is $37.6 million. There was a total of $45 million placed in the landfill remediation account initially. 17 was appropriated for the department to begin work. There were some subsequent transfers from that account to the cease and transfer program in 2016 and 2018. But the program has been moving forward since 2015 in pretty steady measure. So going back to the final bullet, that addresses the 2015 modification that was made to the corrective action account that stated that beginning in 2019, diversions could be made from the corrective action account to the landfill remediation in certain amounts, and it was a staggered amount, so it slowly increased in amount that could be transferred. In 2019, that was $1 million for the landfill remediation program. So, and the point behind that was we wanted to maintain the fund soundness for our storage tank program, but as the number of contaminated sites, as you saw, is going down, that provided an opportunity to provide a reliable source of funding for the landfill remediation program moving forward. So, we've been moving forward with that, and we've just started making diversions from the corrective action account to the landfill remediation program last year, and we'll be presenting a report to this committee in a couple weeks, making our recommendations for making some additional appropriations as well. As I indicated, the investigation and remediation is underway at the 5 of the highest priority landfills. We're also trying to attack this list from a couple other different ways. We're trying to take a look at the other landfills on the list to see if they're ranked appropriately on the priority list. We're taking a look at some ways we can try to refine the cleanup costs. And we're also taking a look at the cleanup standards that are going to be necessary for some of these landfills on the list by taking a look at the background groundwater quality of these areas, which could have impacts upon what the ultimate remediation standards are there. The landfill remediation account currently has a balance of $9.2 million, excuse me, and we do anticipate that fund will be drawn down on, and we'll need to use more money from the corrective action account in the years forward. The cease and transfer program, this kind of came out hand in hand with the landfill remediation program, and it arose out of the groundwater contamination in landfills, as well as the cost of operating a landfill were kind of rising out beyond the control of many of our local governments. So they needed assistance to close smaller unlined landfills and transfer it to more regional lined landfills. And under this program, the legislature created the program which provides up to 75% of the cost of constructing transfer stations or landfill closures in the form of grants and loans. So to date, the legislature has provided $60 million in funding for the program. As you can see, about $49.5 million in grants, 10.5 in loans. This kind of just goes back through a little bit of the history. We make recommendations to the state, the SLIB board, for whenever we receive an application. So that is who makes the final determination on funds that are awarded under the program. So the original list, we had 52 facilities on the list, and the original estimate was around $98 million for all the projects. As of May 1st, we've funded 30 projects on the list. We've funded, or well, I should say the state has funded projects for a total of $45.5 million. We have a total of $18.5 million left in the account. And we anticipate, or the estimated cost for the remaining 19 projects is $27.3 million. Now that's 100% of the cost. So under the program, we'd be only looking at that 75% of that. And we do try to refine the costs as we get engineer estimates for all the projects.
So, Mr. Esch, this is one of these rare situations where the initial estimates and then how the program was managed is made those initial estimates to be high. We're actually getting more done for less than what we thought back in, what was it, 2010 or 2011. Is that a fair statement?
Mr. Chairman, that's absolutely correct. You know, and it's attributed to the staff for the program. They do great work. Whenever we get a proposal for a project, we want to make sure that we take a look at it and make sure that their proposal is adequately sized for the community's needs. We don't want any fluff and bells and whistles on these projects. And so we work hand in hand with the operators to make sure that they're best sides for the community's needs. So it's really been a great program, and I think we've done a lot of great work. So.
Well, hats off to DEQ and your staff, but there's 3 members of the original subcommittee that are here today. I was going to compliment them for their work setting up these 2 programs.
Mr. Chairman, that was my next breath. I was going to follow that up right there. Moving on to the orphan site program, Mr. Chairman. So in 2000, the legislature created the orphan site remediation program. And this allows DEQ to take action where there's not a viable, responsible party for a contaminated site, as well as when there's a situation where we need to respond quickly to address a threat to human health and the environment. So as I indicated, an orphan site is a place where it's just a site, but there's no viable, responsible party. So a lot of our orphan sites end up being contamination from old dry cleaners that get leached into the groundwater. So those are some of the typical sites that we have. In 2018, going back to the corrective action account, there was a change made that allowed the orphan site program to utilize funding from the corrective action account in smaller amounts. Obviously, as I mentioned, we need to maintain storage tank program fund soundness, but I think it's up to $1 million each year if there's adequate funds available. And so in 2019, we did make a transfer of $1 million to the orphan site program from the corrective action account. We have 28 known orphan sites. We've completed remediation on 6, working on 13, and 9 are still kind of waiting in the wings. There's another 30 sites where the department may have received some information. Yes, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, Representative Duncan has a question. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Real quick, can you give me an example of an orphan site? I'm not quite wrapping my head around this because a lot of these are landfills. Would someone just walk away from a landfill?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Duncan, the orphan site program is kind of separate from the landfill remediation program. So an example of an orphan site would be an old dry cleaner that had closed down but used to use a lot of PCE in its process that had got into the groundwater. Now, you can't necessarily go after the dry cleaner because they're no longer in business. And so that's a situation where there would not be a viable, responsible party to address that contamination in the groundwater. So, for example, we did have one dry cleaner up in Sheridan next to Big Goose Creek that we entered into the orphan site program and went in and conducted some remediation and got the groundwater addressed at the Sanderson dry cleaner. So that's kind of a site outside of the landfills.
Yeah, Representative Duncan.
Thank you. Follow up. So I'm seeing these down here, like the oil and gas refinery, and so these people just walk away.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Duncan, yes, in essence, the entity, the Crown Oil and Gas Refinery, that was an old historic refinery from, I believe, the 50s that the responsible party, the owner, is no longer around, or we cannot find additional information on these. Another aspect I should say of the orphan site program is we don't have a lot of information about these sites until we really get into using some resources from the orphan site program. We did have one old refinery site that we were able to enter into the orphan site program, and after we got more involved with the site, we were able to actually locate the responsible party, and then they were able to take the over the remediation and clean it up under our voluntary remediation program. So this allows us to get into the site, to dig more, to learn more information about it, as well as pursue responsible parties.
Thank you very much.
And right there, yeah, just it's got a couple.
Representative McGuire has a question. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Along the same lines, the Evanston Roundhouse project, don't we know who's responsible for that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative McGuire, the Evanston Roundhouse site is kind of a different story. So the orphan site program has allowed the groundwater to come in. The Evanston Roundhouse building itself, we do have a good idea of where the contamination came from that. But some of the chemicals that are beneath the site in the groundwater, there was enough uncertainty that rather than allow it to just remain or allow things to drag out through the litigation process of trying to find a responsible party, this allows the state to go in and address a environmental hazard, and then if we find enough information in our process, we can pursue cost recovery. But addressing the environmental risk is, I guess, the primary aim of the program.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rush. Yep, go ahead.
And in summary, so under the storage tank program, this is kind of just a slide of what our rough estimates are for funding needs for these various programs. At this point, we estimate the storage tank program will be able to remediate its known contaminated sites with $53.5 million over the next 10 years. Of course, like I said, they're going to need a continuous source of funding to address new sites that come into the program, but we feel we can address the sites that we're in remediation on with that funds. Landfill remediation program, that is going to take a longer time frame to address all the landfills. I think we've got 83 landfills on that list right now. We feel confident that we can stage the remediation under that program to align with the distributions we receive from the corrective action account in the future. The cease and transfer program, we currently have $18.5 million in the account. And right now we're optimistic that we'll be able to address the remaining projects without additional appropriations. And under the orphan site program, we're projecting a funding need of about $10 million to address what we have on the list, and then additional funding to address what other projects that may come in. We also feel that the legislature providing the appropriation from the corrective action account will allow us to do that moving forward as well. And with that, I'll stop and take questions.
Okay, committee, any questions? I guess one, Luke, is just with respect to leaking underground storage tanks. I assume we've seen a significant reduction in new sites coming on the list over the last 10 years. That's tapered off to, I mean, I realize we had something in Lander here not too long ago, but.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. The number of tanks that we are seeing coming in new releases is significantly less than it used to be. And I think that does come down to our compliance program, where we're out there working with operators, making sure that their tests are being done appropriately and in a timely fashion on their tanks. We have one of the highest compliance ratings in the nation. So we are seeing fewer tanks, and I think it's really it reflects well on the program.
Okay. All right, committee. All right, next topic.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just one other point on solid and hazardous waste. As we discussed yesterday, we're continuing to look for opportunities to get more work out the door within our existing budgetary positions. So we continue to do that. We're going to shift to air quality now, and Luke's going to step out, and Nancy Veer, the administrator for air quality, is going to join us. And the things we're going to cover is we're going to cover the organization and the funding of air quality. We'll talk about the new source review program and then the Title V program. And we'll also talk about what we're doing as we continue to evaluate the funding mechanisms for those programs and ensuring that we have sufficient funds to cover the cost of those programs. And Nancy will cover that. So.
Okay. All right, sounds good.
Okay.
Your air quality program.
Did you get it? We're trying to get the.
Yeah.
There we go.
You have a technical question, ask Senator Coe. He'll help you out.
I think you can walk through it like that. All right.
Okay.
Thank you for getting it set up there for me.
Yep.
Push the button on the left.
All right.
Good afternoon. My name is Nancy Veer. I'm the Air Quality Administrator for the Air Quality Division at the state. And we'll go scroll down here. So this first slide, I just wanted to give you an overview of our structure. We have 75 full-time equivalents, and then we have the programs listed here at the top are our core programs.
Mr. Chairman,
Okay, yeah, we're not seeing the,
you're still on solid waste.
yep,
Oh,
the screen share is not up. We do have the PowerPoint in our book for a handout, but it's nice for those that are following along to be able to see it on the screen for those following along on YouTube.
so that's the solid waste one, is the one on the left there.
I'm not seeing the.
Just close out.
Just go. We're not getting it.
Yeah, because they're just showing our slides. I think you can try to go to.
We see it on our screen.
Yeah,
Our screen is paused.
I'll go get Steve.
okay. What if we do resume?
Yeah, this go ahead, Nancy, and
Okay.
we do have the handout with us.
Okay, I'll refer to the page number then so I'm on page 2 of the PowerPoint. And this gives an overview of our air quality division structure with the various programs. Air quality is one of those areas where we have EPA approved programs such as our Title V or operating permit program. We have primacy programs where those go into state implementation plans that EPA approves, and that are programs involving health-based ambient standard criteria pollutants like ozone, carbon monoxide, lead, nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter. And then we have what are called delegated programs. And these are the new source performance standards and national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants. Altogether, those make up the air quality division programs that we manage. Slide 3 is an overview of the air quality division funding. And this is our current funding mix. These are rounded numbers, and this is for the upcoming biennium. And we get a mix of state general funds, federal grants, which are the 105 grant program and the 103 grant program. 105 grants have a state match of 40%. 60% is the federal grant. The 103 grant has no match. Then we have some special revenue accounts. We get emission fees for our operating permit program, also known as Title V. And we get construction permitting fees for our new source review program. And then we had some special revenue from the JIO PAPO up in the Jonah, Pinedale anticline.
So can I ask a question, just so?
Sure.
So the dollar amount is the total dollar amount, and the percentage is the federal percent or state percent?
So the percent, for example, state general fund makes up about 32% of our biennial budget. Federal grants make up about 7% of our biennial budget. And our special revenue, Title V and new source review, our fees make up 61% of our budget.
Sorry, I need to read from the top down instead of left to right. Okay, I got it. Sorry.
Okay. So the next slide, page 4, want to touch on new source review. And one of the significance on both the new source review permitting program and our Title V operating permit program are that we get reductions in emissions in concert with industry and public input. We have economic growth that is protective of air quality. You'll see on the chart on the volume, we have the chart on the left is based on an annual number of permit applications. And you'll see over the last 2 years, oil and gas applications make up about half of what we had seen in the past few years. Our permitting numbers went down a little bit in 2015 and then rebounded and have been going up steadily. On the chart on the right, it took the first quarter for 2018, first quarter 2019, and first quarter 2020 to show that we were on a trajectory of having increased applications through the first quarter. More recent numbers coming in reflect the decrease in oil and gas applications. So these numbers will change over the course of 2020 and likely not be as high as we've seen in 2019 and 2018. Our fees are $464 an application, and then we charge $58 an hour. Those fees have been flat for over a decade. Just to remind you, these fees make up about 15% of our air quality budget. We send out invoices after we've worked on a permit application. And so the reason I have bankruptcies flagged there is right now we have about $113,000 in new source review fees that are tied up in bankruptcy claims. Sometimes those take a couple of years to resolve. Most of the companies are in a Chapter 11 situation. We also are looking at e-payment options to see about changing some of the timing on collecting our NSR fees, to do that more of an upfront process so that we're not chasing dollars. We have about $250,000 in NSR fees that are over 90 days past due. And that takes a great deal of staff resources and attorney resources to go after those. Positive notes on efficiencies are the impact program. Impact has increased our transparency and access to information, as well as allowed us to conduct e-business. Sources can enter permits, enter compliance reports, obtain inspection information. all of this electronically, and with the COVID-19 teleworking that's been in place, it's been a pretty seamless transition. It has also allowed our permitting processing timelines to be decreased. Open Air is our publicly accessible information site, so the public can access information like applications. Other efficiencies we've gained have been through our oil and gas guidance, which was updated a little over a year ago. Slide 5 talks about our operating permit program. And we have on our operating permit program, our program has applies to facilities that emit over 100 tons per year of criteria pollutants. Non-attainment areas have a lower threshold. So for example, I was listening to a webinar last week. The Denver Metro Northern Front Range non-attainment area had been at 100 tons level, and they had about 60 Title V sources. They got bumped up to serious non-attainment for ozone, which dropped that threshold to 50 tons, and they now have 600 Title V sources that are going to come into their program. Huge resource, large economic impact. We currently have 113 Title.
Has a question? Sorry,
Yep.
I'll just interrupt you, Nancy, as we get questions. So go ahead, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nancy, yeah, I'm not quite up with you on this. Can you give me the definition of a non-attainment area? What's going on with that?
Sure. There are criteria pollutants, those pollutants I mentioned at the beginning, like ozone, particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, and the like. There are 6 of them. EPA sets health-based standards and a threshold for those pollutants. If you are meeting those health-based thresholds, you're called in attainment. If your air is poorer quality, you're considered non-attainment. And there are certain requirements that EPA puts in place that you have to reduce your emissions to get back into attainment. Wyoming has one.
Okay, Representative McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm just wondering, is there a confidential tip program for miscellaneous facilities that may be producing objectionable biologic odors right now?
Sensitive subject. Go ahead, Nancy. You're going to talk about our one attainment area in Wyoming.
Okay, so Wyoming has an ozone non-attainment area, the Upper Green River Basin. It's in the winter time, and that's for the 2008 ozone standard. Under that standard, Wyoming had 3 years to start meeting that standard, and we are meeting it and have been meeting it since that 2015 deadline. It's still formally designated as non-attainment because we have to prepare certain information to submit to EPA to be redesignated. That's our only non-attainment area in Wyoming. On the Title V program, we currently have 113 facilities. When this program started back in the mid to late 1990s, there was over 140 facilities. This program has worked in that the number of emissions have decreased, and those are our primary types of facilities here in Wyoming in this program. Next slide is page 6, and that covers our operating permit program fees, which make up about 46% of the air quality budget. Our facilities report on a calendar year annual emissions. So we've just gotten reports in this spring for the 2019 calendar year. They pay $1 per ton emission fee. So in 2020, we're getting paid for the 2019 calendar year emissions. Under state statute and regulations, we have a 4,000 ton per pollutant cap, and those are the pollutants that we collect fees on. Carbon monoxide is exempt under regulations. Wyoming's per ton fee rate is $34.50. It has been at that rate since 2012, and it is lower than EPA's current presumptive rate of $52.03. And we have in Wyoming a minimum fee set by regulation of $500. So the lowest fee a Title V source can pay is $500, and then it goes up until they hit this $4,000 ton per pollutant cap. Lots of states' air quality programs are facing fee challenges. Our fee is among the lowest, if not the lowest, in the nation. The next slide on page 7, this is a 3-year average percent fee by industry. And this is, so when you look at the industry category there to the left, you'll see a 3-year annual average fee for that category. And then basically a split on the pie. This will shift as our source mix changes. The next slide is our billable emissions trend. And my apologies, I'm going to go through and explain this chart a little bit because it's got a lot of information on there, and I don't have the technical talent myself to color code various things. So I want to explain. You'll see that blue trend starts on the left-hand side, and it's actual through December 31st, 2018. So those are our actual trend up until December 31st, 2018 of the billable tons that we had. Then the rest of that blue line going off to the right is an estimate from December 31st, 2018 out to the year 2038 of where we projected based on information we had at the time of where we thought emissions would be. Then you'll see this red line, and it starts at that dot of calendar year 2019. That's where we actually came in. So our estimate in the blue line and our where we came in for calendar year 2019 when we got the information this spring is a difference of, I'll say, roughly 10,000 tons. So we came in a little bit under, which is a good thing for air quality, more challenging from a budgeting perspective. We came in under at what we thought we would get for emissions. That revised COVID estimate for calendar year 2020 and calendar year 2021 are we have had facilities that have sent notices to us because of other challenges in their particular industry that they are not, some of them have had to shut in. You may have seen production well sites that have had to shut in. So some of our compressor stations that are larger have also had to shut in. We have had power plants operating at reduced capacity, and we have had some trona facilities that have closed for a period of months. Some of these facilities anticipate opening up into the summer and fall, but we really aren't sure. So that's why that line is pretty short, because we know it's going to be down. We just don't know how far it will trend down. And then that vertical line is where companies reported their actual numbers, and that's how we came up with that difference. So the purpose of this to show is when you take the tons that we get, times it by our fees, if it's 10,000 tons, we might be off by about $345,000 per year. If we're further off, then we get close to $1 million or more dollars per year. And so we're going to, as we get all this information come in, we'll take a look, and that goes to the next slide, page 9, on how we might be able to address some of the challenges between revenue and expenditure in the air quality program. There may be programmatic changes. We spend right now about $150,000 a year on legal notices in the newspaper. We might be able to go to online doing those in our through our website. Some of these changes may require statutory changes or regulatory changes. We're going to look at streamlining. You may have heard us talk before when we came up in front of land quality a couple of years ago on doing general permitting for some of our sand and gravel operations. And then we might have to adjust some service levels or expectations. On our fees, the NSR program, we might look at options like e-payment, doing the collections up front instead of at the back end, so we have less exposure there, changing our rate, those type of items. And then on the operating permit program, looking at what it might mean if we remove the 4,000 ton cap, charging for carbon monoxide, changing our rates, changing the minimum thresholds, and looking at other fee structures there. So that's kind of the overview of the air quality program. I did not go into all the detail of what each of our programs and sections do within air quality, but we've got good air. That's the positive note.
Okay, committee, any questions? Okay, so I sense an increase in emission fees. Are those set by rule?
Some are set by rule, and some are set in terms of some of the thresholds. There's some, maybe the 4,000 ton is a statutory and regulatory. The formula is set in rule.
Okay. So, yeah, go ahead, Representative Bear.
Get me unmuted here, sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question on a couple of, one slide back where you were talking about the three-year average percent fees by industry type.
Yes.
Yeah, EGUs listed there, and I don't know what that is.
Oh, electrical generating units, more commonly known as power plants. We do them on a by unit basis.
Very good, thank you.
Yep.
Okay. Any further questions? So I'll just make a comment, given the fact I have to write a check every year under this program. And one of those is that the service that's provided where you come out and we'll check and do some monitoring in advance each year is quite valuable. And I know we find value in that. I don't know of other people within the program do or not, but just keep that in mind.
Thank you. Great.
All right, so Mr. Chairman, if that's all right, then with the committee, we'll move on to the abandoned mineland program. We'll be brief on this, although it looks like it's a thick presentation. There are a lot of photographs just to give examples of the type of work that we do. And so I'm going to try to transfer or transition to that presentation.
No, that's perfect. You know, we used to hear from Mr. Edwards about twice a year on this program, and it's kind of one that's been pushed off to the side, but it's still important nonetheless.
Now, can you see the screen or the presentation on the screen?
No, we're still on the air quality slide 9.
Screen. Which one is this one?
Here we go. We got it.
All right. Control.
Are you ready, Mr. Chairman?
We are.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. My name is Alan Edwards. I'm the administrator of the Wyoming Abandoned Mineland Program and also the Deputy Director for DEQ. Since everybody's had my slides for roughly 2 weeks, I'm going to hit some of the high points and then sort of move on towards the end on how we're currently managing the program, what we're doing now and potentially into next year. Because based on the conversation yesterday, that seemed like a topic of interest. So just, I want to touch on this one first. prior to the, there we go, prior to, yeah, the director is always making sure I'm pointed in the right direction. But prior to 1977, coal companies, basically, when they were done operating, would walk away. They did very little, if any, reclamation. So in 1977, Congress passed the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, SMCRA, to address that issue. So it established actually two programs. One was the Coal Regulatory and Reclamation Program. That is the program that DEQ Land Quality operates today. The other was the Title IV, which is the AML program. So it established the program and then also set a fee based on every ton of coal produced for the purposes of being used for reclamation. I want to touch on this slide a little bit just to talk about the funds flow and how the money flows through the system. The program at the federal level is operated by the Office of Surface Mining. They collect a fee on coal for every federal fiscal year. At the end, in the first quarter of the next fiscal year, they go through and true that up, summarize it, and then determine what the 50% share is that should go to each state. That money then is distributed in the second quarter of that following fiscal year. And as many of you probably know, it goes through the state budgeting process. And once the budget's been approved, we make application to OSM for our grant. When that's approved, our funding goes into effect in that state fiscal year. So there's a little lag in there, but that's just kind of the sense of how that goes. Our program, the AML program, was officially created in 1983 when our plan was approved by the Secretary of the Interior. I want to note here this final bullet because I'll touch on that later. The act provided that 50% of the reclamation fee would return to the state in which it was originated. So we should get, 50% of the fee collected in Wyoming. But I'll prompt it by saying we're supposed to, and I'll get into that later. Wyoming indicated in 1984 that we had completed all known or had a plan to complete all known remaining reclamation. So we became certified. Keep in mind at that point in time, the field inventories were all done by boots on the ground. So we had an extremely small inventory. But what this did is that it created a greater flexibility for use of the funding, including the use for some non-coal reclamation and also for public facilities under certain circumstances. Our inventory continues to grow. Through work last year, based on our experience and the knowledge we gained, we stepped up 2 years ago an accelerated field inventory program. It's primarily directed at addressing existing infrastructure in the state and the potential for impact to those from underground mines that are slowly coming to the surface. Our work last year identified another $120 million that we added to the inventory, which is for the purposes, like I say, of protecting existing infrastructure, buildings, and likewise. In 2006, the act was amended to make some other changes. It made payments to AML states mandatory. Prior to 2006, it was subject to congressional appropriation. And for several years, as a budget balancing mechanism, they under appropriated and didn't appropriate the full 50%. So the funds that weren't appropriated remained in the trust fund and then were returned to the states as prior balance funds. Some of you were around and are very familiar with those funds and the legislative authority that was over that. But I do want to note that the prior balance funding has been totally received. So that was a past product, but it's no longer in place. Again, we're supposed to receive equal to 50. The way the work act that the funding flow works now after the 2006 amendments is the 50% share based on our collection. We actually do not receive from the AML Reclamation Fund. That money goes to the uncertified programs who have huge reclamation inventories, but in exchange, Wyoming gets paid out of Treasury. So we're getting general Treasury funding. That's why it's called in lieu, because we're paid out of Treasury in lieu of getting our 50% out of the trust fund. And as it's noted in there, there's very specific purposes for which the fund can be used. There's 3 priorities established under the Act for funding. And basically, priority 1 is what we need to focus on. Priority 2, the real difference from that, if you notice under the number 1, is it's protection from extreme danger. Priority 2 is adverse effects. And number 3, which we hardly get to priority 3 projects, is it just affects things that have been degraded. So again, to highlight this, the first priority is still to address the high priority coal reclamation before doing non-coal. And the other thing though is even if there's some high priority coal reclamation remaining, if we have non-coal reclamation that is an equal to or higher priority than remaining coal reclamation, we have been authorized to use some of the funds for that purpose. Now we'll get back to we were supposed to receive 50%, and keep in mind too, after 2006, we get mandatory payments. But since 2013, AML distributions have been subject to federal sequestration. That amount has ranged from 5.2 to 7.2. Our distribution this year was sequestered at 5.9%. So to date, funds that we should have received that we did not total a little over $24 million.
So then, Mr. Edwards, do those go into a potential prior balance column?
It's confusing. For the uncertified programs, it's our understanding that the money remains in the trust fund, although there's still mixed guidance from the Office of Surface Mining about that. Since we are paid out of general treasury, there was an assumption that those monies basically went back into the federal budget. And I'll touch on this later, but there is a proposal to return those sequestered funds to the state that was raised in the House last year. So we'll see where that goes. But right now, we don't have access to it, and we may not unless the AML fund is reauthorized.
And so that initiative in the House last year, was that the initiative where those would be returned for economic development in areas affected by a downturn in the coal industry?
Mr. Chairman, that's a totally separate bill. That was a bill called Reclaim. So that's separate. And, you know, I'm not a fan of that particular piece of legislation, so we'll leave it at that. But there was a bill introduced in the House. Let me back up for a second, Mr. Chairman. I was going to touch on it later, but this would be an appropriate place. The AML fee is set to expire in September 31, 2021. Under that scenario, the last payment we would get, unless the fee is reauthorized, would be in 2022. There was a proposal, a very clean proposal introduced in the House that would reauthorize AML for 7 years, and it was very clean. The SMACRA language is complicated. This was a very clean, it would extend it for 7 years. But it also provided that all of the funds sequestered between 2013 and 2018 would be returned to the programs. For us then, that would have been roughly 16 million. But I understand there's proposals to amend that to just simply pay all sequestration back. So that's a work in progress in Congress right now.
Okay, thank you.
To move on then, Mr. Chairman, under the current status, You know, again, we're continuing to do our inventory. The new technology is wonderful. All prior balance funds have been returned. Last year, we had a unique opportunity because when all known coal and non-coal reclamation sites have been funded, certain specific public facilities could be considered. We had that circumstance that came up last year. Last year, we received about 94 million with what we knew at the time. Keep in mind the distribution comes in usually February. And we got our grant and it was budgeted beginning July 1. We had 20.6 million left over that could be applied for public facilities. But with our additional inventory work, we don't foresee that public facilities is going to be an option in the foreseeable future. So like I said, it was announced in February, we got that. There were 84 communities who applied to receive funding, and 10 projects were approved through the process that's established here. Those 10 projects are identified here, so there's quite a distribution. Public facility could be water and sewer, roads, medical facilities. So there's some very specific, but they have to be for a local governing body, so like counties, joint powers boards, if they're allowed to make application, and cities. So as the director indicated yesterday, you know, some of these may be delayed because under the current economic situation, if they have difficulty raising the match they indicated they were going to provide. Keep in mind, it wasn't a set match that everybody had to do, because some communities had some money set aside, but if they're being economically challenged, some of these might be delayed. So this is just very quick, points out a lot of the work that we have accomplished and what we've done, which actually since 1983, when our program was approved, it's actually accomplished a lot. So I want to touch on just this in 2019 and then talk just extremely briefly about our staffing. And then I'd like to talk, Mr. Chairman, if that would be appropriate, about how we handle these projects and what I might foresee going forward. In 2019, the director shared some of this stuff with you. We had roughly 56 million between construction and consulting, and AML Reclamation had provided about 577 direct jobs. Now, by direct, that doesn't include the people who deliver the fuel. It doesn't include the subcontractors that might be working on there. We're trying to drill down for that and to find out how much of that money that goes to a contractor is spent for those other items, say on bullet 4. But as an example, we had one project in the Gas Hills alone that used 248,000 gallons of diesel. So somebody had to deliver that. The state tax was paid on that, so it was pretty significant. Our program focuses on taking the greatest percentage of the money we receive and getting it into the field, either through the consultants or through the contractors. We have a very small staff, as noted there, which is 12, which includes myself. So the staff does a lot of work. So for here, I'd like to touch on what through DEQ, the AML program, has done to try to make the maximum amount of money available for especially our local contractors. Every year, even if we have projects that are being phased, so there's going to be multiple phases of work, we size the projects so they can be done in a single construction season. That means that Wyoming, and like in the case of the Gas Hills, they're earthworks contractors. They're at a size amount that they can be competitive, they can bond for it, so it increases their likelihood that they'll be selected. Keep in mind, out-of-state firms can bid, the 5% in-state preference applies. But we also have another program which we call our statewide contracts. They tend to be for our really smaller projects where it's really too expensive to advertise for every individual project. Because we have some projects that come up that could be as little as $3,000 to $10,000. So we bid for and receive proposals from contractors where they submit, here's the type of work they can do, the equipment they have, and if they're qualified, we issue them what's called a statewide contract. There's two sizes. One is 100,000, one is 300,000. And then as all of these smaller projects come up, we then issue task orders to those statewide contracts, and we distribute that around the list that we have. And a lot of that includes really, really small contractors that might have a backhoe and a front end loader and a truck, to even the larger ones who want to be available to do smaller work from time to time. Last year, we had 48 statewide contracts. We went out for another solicitation last fall. We're now up to 64. So that's how we distribute the work. My staff this year has been very creative. They've gone through the teleworking. They do web-based consulting selection. They even did consultant interviews through web-based. We do all of our pre-construction and our pre-bid conferences through that, and both the consultants and the contractors say that alone saves them time and money. So that's worked really well, which has helped us accelerate getting some of the projects out. This is how the past and the remaining AML sites were scattered around the state. There's no corner of the state that isn't touched. Wanted to throw a couple of slides in here. This is a shallow mine. The underground mine was about 35 feet deep. This opened up in an access road to a ranch north of Sheridan. Here's one that opened up out just off somebody's doorstep. It's a good thing he walked out the door in the daylight, not after dark. Here's an example of some of the big projects. Here's one of the large projects in the Gas Hills. The way it was left, there was a heap leach site on the top, so you got acid drainage and sedimentation going into Coyote Springs, which was a serious hazard and a contaminant. Here's another one, which was the Bulrush, same thing, acid forming and mine waste. Here's an example of one of our projects that is a phase, and it's a little deceptive from here, but from the top of the high wall to the bottom of the water pit, it's 400 feet. The high wall that you see is 300, and this is an area that's getting increasing recreational use. The water quality was starting to deteriorate. We have mine fires that we monitor. Once in a while, they erupt through the surface. That was it. As it was put out, you notice the utility line above, that was it reclaimed. Here was one of those aha moments where the dozer operator is probably still telling his kids about that. We knew there was an old mine shaft in the area. We couldn't find it. There were no records of it. We found it this way. The dozer had actually been parked on top of it. And when the dozer started to back up, it started to fall in. It's very fortunate the dozer was moving and got off. Otherwise, it could have been hazard. Here's one of the typical problems we dealt with in Rock Springs. Blairtown Park was a little league softball field. It was a sledding hill in the winter. Very, very shallow mine. Some of the mine voids were as little as 15 to 20 feet below the surface. They had several of those openings. We went out through drilling and grouting and took care of it. And the next two are just sort of human interest. These are reclaimed sites where the revegetation has come in. So I hope that was helpful, Mr. Chairman.
No, I think it was. Yeah. Committee, any questions? Okay, I'm going to go Representative Burkhart, then Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Alan, the De Loma pit and all of that, has all that reclamation been completed now?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Burkhart, no, it has not. We have, I believe, 5 more phases on the De Loma and 2 or 3 on the McIntosh. And once again, we're sizing those out for a few years so the in-state contractors have an ability to bid on them.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, follow up. Yep. Will you be working on those projects this year again?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Burkhart, yes. As a matter of fact, those projects have already been bid, the contracts awarded, and I believe their notice to proceed has been issued. So both of those should be underway as we speak.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Looking at the list of projects, there seems to be some good variety there. I was just wondering if you could summarize, if you will, any restrictions on the use of the funds intuitively, it sounds like it has to be linked to the mining, but are there specific restrictions that communities and, local governments might want to keep in mind?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Henderson, if I could ask for clarification, are you referring to the 10 projects that were approved through? Yes. It's important to note that the money we receive is federal dollars. So every project still has to do its NEPA clearance. But we are conducting, AML is, those clearances on their behalf. But as you can gather, all of those are in previously disturbed sites. So we're hoping just a small categorical exclusion. They also have to meet the federal requirements on minimum pay, non-discrimination, et cetera. But my staff have really stepped up on this one. They've worked very closely with all the communities. They've made sure they understand all this. They're available to ask questions as they proceed. So the staff has taken great efforts to make sure they fully understand.
Okay. Any further questions? Okay, I do have one. So prior to 2019, we had a set inventory of known reclamation, and that was going into zero. So then we had, it looks like about $20 million that were left over that went into this grant program that's ran through the SLIP board. And those are the 10 projects that went out to the communities. But since then, your inventory has increased by 125 million, and seems to be increasing further. And I asked this question because we'll get asked this, and so that means for the foreseeable future that there won't be any funds available for that community grant process. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. And again, keep in mind the distribution came out in January. We got the award, but our field inventory work continued throughout the course of the year, and I got the summary report at the end of the year. We're continuing that extensive field inventory this year because what we found last year through that process is some areas that were extremely unsettling. And I'll give you one example. There's a little corridor south of Rock Springs that has 2 or 3 natural gas pipelines on it. The drilling indicated that mine subsidence had worked its way up to being about 5 foot below the surface. And those mine voids extended along the pipeline for about 1.5 miles. So as that inventory continues to grow, coal production declines, our AML distribution will continue to decline. I in the foreseeable future, do not see any avenue to be able to fund public facilities again.
Okay. So then just to follow up to that, with the public facilities that were awarded, those funds, for lack of a better term, have been obligated. So if those programs move forward within a reasonable period of time, I guess the funds will be there for them. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. The OSM already approved the grant in our last year's grant. We identified the 20.6 million that was available. This year, we provided the table with the 10 projects to specifically identify which projects and for how much money. So that money is already earmarked in the federal grant.
Okay, thank you. Okay, committee, any further questions? Representative Burkhart?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not really a question, more of a comment. If you get a chance, go out and look at some of these projects. I think if you call Mr. Edwards, he can arrange it for you. Some of this work that they've done is really impressive, especially if you know what's been in there in the past versus what you have now. That De Loma project, I've seen that. They actually reestablished a stream bed so it's back to almost pristine from what it was. So if you want to see what it looks like on the ground, I'd recommend anybody in the committee go do that. It's some impressive work.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Sure.
Could I add just one thing? I neglected to do that. You know, the AML staff is really ramping up the work this year, but and basically it's for selfish reasons because we want those contractors to be around for our work next year. But what the staff is also doing on their own initiative is they're going through all the other projects we have in the inventory to identify which ones we can accelerate NEPA on or whatever. So we have projects teed up next year as well, because we foresee these challenges for the contractors extending in the next year as well. So they're trying to position the program to be as helpful as possible next year.
All right, good message. Yeah, thank you. Okay, committee. Well, with that, Director Parfit and Mr. Edwards, a pleasure. Director, do you have anything further for us?
I don't have anything further other than we'll continue to explore opportunities to get additional contract work out the door.
Very good. Let me ask LSO before we let you go, Director. Is there anyone, I see a few people in the waiting room, but they're for the next topic. Is there anyone that signed up? I just don't see anything for this.
Mr.
Subject.
Chairman, we did not have anyone sign up for this topic.
Okay. So why don't we, the committee does anybody need to take a break? I do. Okay. So Representative Burkhart, do you mind just taking the helm and getting us set up here? Or, well, here, I'll do it and then I'll take a break. So, okay, let's go ahead and thank you again, Director. Let's go ahead and move on to the next topic. And what I think I'll do is, Brian, were you prepared to give us just a little bit of an overview of how this came to minerals and where we are? And then what we have for people to comment, we got Commissioner Rood with the Insurance Commission, who is going to discuss a little bit about what he is seeing on this particular issue with air ambulance. And then we have Richard Mincer, an attorney representing one of the service providers. And then we have my commissioner, Fred Franson, who is going to testify a little bit about the impact here in Washtenaw County. And I guess, Brian, just a little bit on this is we were assigned to look at a statewide service. I'm more interested in fixing a regulatory blunder myself, but so with that, Brian, if you could give us a little bit of overview, and then I'll see Representative Burkhart. So Senator Coe, could you, Representative Burkhart. Yeah, I just need a minute, folks. Sorry.
Okay. Brian, go ahead.
Okay, Mr. Vice Chairman. Just by way of a very brief overview, Management Council met in the middle of May to assign COVID-related topics to interim committees. One of the topics assigned to mineral was the study of a state-coordinated EMS transport helicopter service, and that was the topic that was assigned to the committee. In reference to Chairman Greer's comment, in 2019, the legislature passed House Bill 194, and this was a bill concerning air ambulance coverage for Medicaid. One of the changes that was made in the bill amended existing statute, amending the definition of disability insurance to also mean subscription or membership plans relating to air ambulance transport services. This part of that House bill took effect on April 1st, 2020. The Department of Insurance, in interpreting that provision, interpreted it as such to mean that all air ambulance membership and subscription companies that were operating in Wyoming must be licensed as disability insurers with the Department of Insurance by April 1st, 2020. Beyond that, Mr. Vice Chairman, I don't have much else in terms of overview, in terms of a broader concept, if any, is being contemplated, but I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay, any questions for Brian? Brian, I go ahead, Representative McGuire.
Thank you. Do we have any materials that we should have in front of us for this?
Mr. Chairman, Representative McGuire, as of now, I do not.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Chairman, I guess it's back to you. I guess I would say I think every one of us has gotten phone calls about this issue. So with that, Mr. Chairman, it's all yours.
Okay, and let me answer.
Oh,
I heard
Representative Rothfuss.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairman, I was going to provide a little bit more context in that part of the problem that we have here is the fact that a lot of hard work went into putting together a waiver request for the Center for Medicaid Services, and that was a substantial part of the bill, was the idea that there would be a request made that would change the structure of funding within the state of Wyoming and flow funding for air ambulances through Medicaid services. It was a very thoughtful approach, good waiver written up, and CMS turned the state of Wyoming down for that waiver request with very little explanation and basically just said, yeah, we don't want to do that. So a lot of, I think, the concern that comes from the change in that language really comes from the fact that CMS didn't approve the waiver request, which probably would have gone a lot better in terms of the language working out had that been the case. So I think that's a big part of the background story and more of the impetus for the bill. The bill was not entirely structured behind this provision change that has caused the problems. It was really structured around this waiver being sought through CMS.
Yeah, so getting back into this, yeah, we're a little bit to Representative McGuire's question. Yeah, we don't have anything prepared. This subject came to us through Management Council as part of their COVID list. Chairman Anderson's not here, but so I'll speak for him a little bit. We discussed this, and we had very similar feelings as the chairman of our respective houses. And I think Senator Rothfuss said this correct. There was an effort to try to get a Medicaid waiver that would work for this. There was an amendment that came out of the Senate that rolled through, and then we just concurred with it, that made the requirement that these services that are providing the memberships would have to submit to the same regulation as a disability insurance carrier, which is a health insurance carrier under our statutes. I, for one, was embarrassed by the fact that I missed that. It was not the primary focus. And then as this started to roll out, the phone calls came in. Within my district, I received more phone calls over this particular issue than I have over anything in my 10 years in the legislature. And so Washakie County has a very unique situation, and that's why I'm glad Commissioner Franzen will be here to explain that to all of you. Senator Anderson and I thought, seeing how this was on our list, we would take a look at a couple of options here. One is that we repeal that particular clause that requires a regulation, or as I've talked to people in this realm, is something more of regulation light. And I think as we hear some testimony that while in certain areas of the state, mine in particular, our services worked very, very well for our citizens. There are other places where maybe senior citizens in particular are buying expensive memberships when they really don't need to because they're covered otherwise. And so that some sort of consumer protection might be good for the citizens of Wyoming and industry as well. So that's my precursor to trying to table or set up this. Senator Rothfuss?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And, you know, I'd say going back to the impetus for the legislation in the first place, I think there are some circumstances where these services in this particular type of insurance provision has been working well, but overall, the system had not been working well in the state, which was the impetus for the legislation, and there had not been a lot of cooperation from the service providers themselves. I'm not talking about the insurers, I'm talking about the service providers. working with the state in trying to come up with a system which would allow it to be affordable. And what you end up getting is this balanced billing effect, where even if you have some type of insurance provision in place, there were many circumstances in the state where the insurance that was in place was not sufficient to cover the bill. So the balance would just get forced back on the individual, and then frequently that individual would end up unemployed. And that's under the, excuse me, not unemployed, but bankrupt. And that's under the best circumstance where you actually had some type of healthcare coverage. So I think what we've been hearing is the idea that there are programs out there that have been effective. But the irony here that I see is what this regulation basically says: you have to adhere to stringent levels of coverage and protection as an insurer, and we're getting pushback. So I do think there's more to it than simply repealing it. And I wish we did have materials. I wish we knew more. I'm certainly not steeped in knowledge of what we can do better for that consumer protection, but I do think there's more to the story than just, oh, well, that's screwed up, let's get rid of it. I hope we can do better than that, Mr. Chairman.
Well, there's always more to the story, Senator Rothfuss said, but I also like repealing it. It's a good idea. So anyway, Representative Duncan, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I got lots and lots of phone calls, emails, text messages, and when I gave the explanation that we got from Representative Barlow and several, and I passed that information forward, surprisingly to me, I didn't get any pushback from my constituents after they reached out to the companies. So I would be curious as to the companies and follow up on that, because I never got any follow through from the constituents. They seemed to be happy and they were okay with, and they never came back. So I do know that it's a big deal in my area, with Fort Laramie being very remote. Lingle, Torrington, you know, they utilize a lot of this from the regional west. Even though we do have Torrington Hospital and we have air services, there's a lot of ranches, there's a lot of remote areas throughout our whole county. But interesting and failure on my part that I didn't follow through back with these constituents, and I will promise to go, you know, make some phone calls in the meantime. But I haven't heard anything back after I gave them that little bit of information and history. So I'd like to know more, I guess.
Well, that's what we're here for. So, okay, let me set this up. So we've got someone, Commissioner Rudd from the Insurance Commission. He can tell us what he's received, where they're at. We have Mr. Mincer, who represents one of the companies. And then Commissioner Franzen, who's again from my district. So that we'll learn, and we should keep an open mind on what's appropriate. So I had Representative Burkhart, then Representative McGuire, and then we'll try to get to some testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question, maybe for you or for staff or whoever can answer it. There was the requirement in the statutes from the bill to go to CMS with this request with a plan, which has been rejected. Does anyone know if there's any follow through on that? Are we going to submit another plan, or did the entire thing just die after someone said, no, we don't accept Wyoming's plan? That's a curiosity question. I just wanted to know, where we stood.
Yeah, so I know the answer to that, but I'll let Senator Rothfuss answer. It's fine. Well, I'll just go real quick. We brought that back again this year. In 2020, we addressed that issue to go back with another plan to try again. That was the legislation this year. So the legislation that caused this issue was the 2019 legislation. When we were rejected, if you recall, Representative Majority Floor Leader Barlow brought this back, stood it back up to go back with a revised plan and try again. So that's the status there. Is that, Senator Rothfuss, you agree generally? Okay, good. Representative McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And of course, a lot of why we're here is because of a letter that was sent out by one provider to people that they were selling their service to, where they didn't even have coverage. And that uncovers one of the issues that I had with it. And when it was passed, I noticed that it did place these services underneath the insurance commissioner for the state of Wyoming, which I thought was a good idea because, and I'd just like us to keep this concept in mind as we're going through this, the nature of how this comes about. Somebody has an accident out on the highway. Air ambulance is called. People are shoved on the helicopter. It takes off. Emergency situation. Well, then when the dust settles a couple months later, and you start going through who's going to pay, finally, nobody's going to pay. So here's this big bill. Here's this balanced bill. The problem is for the consumers is that they don't have any place where they can really go and get any kind of a hearing or some kind of a equal footing. And that's why I thought it was a good idea to have the insurance commissioner involved, because then you have somebody who has equal authority, equal power to help you negotiate as a consumer. And that's the problem that we've had in the past is if you get that bill and you took advantage of the services, you may have been unconscious at the time, but still you were transported by that company. Well, now all of a sudden you've got this big, huge bill, and what are you going to do? Go file a case in district court that you're going to lose anyway and spend thousands and thousands of dollars to go further in debt? So I would just hope that we would keep in mind that I think it's important for us to have some kind of a equalization for the consumers of the state. Thank you.
Yep, good comments. Okay, are you guys ready? All right, let's go ahead and get the commissioner to come on in and tell us where we are, what he's been hearing, what issues he was dealing with consumers. So, Commissioner, please introduce yourself and have at it.
Thank you very much, Chairman Greer, committee members. It's Jeff Rude. We're the Commissioner of the Wyoming Department of Insurance. I think the run-up that LSO gave was and Senator Rothfuss gave was accurate. This little niche of the memberships was sort of put in our arena to regulate. And in essence, it did require a license as a disability insurer if you're going to sell the memberships. If you're not going to sell the memberships, your regular business just goes on as usual. To date, we have one company that did go through the process. They've been very cooperative, and they are licensed, and they are able to sell memberships under the statute. I'm often asked, what are the benefits of licensing and how can they help consumers? I'll run down a few of those just to give you the background. One thing to begin with is if a company's licensed, we will look at their advertising. One of the problems that people don't necessarily understand is there might be 8 or 9 air ambulance companies that fly throughout Wyoming for the bulk of the flights. There's actually up to 20 or more that actually could, but 8 or 9 really do the bulk of the business. But you can have a membership with one, and that's the only one that'll pay if you're picked up. And obviously you don't have any control over who picks you up when you're in an accident or you've had a fall in the backcountry. And for actually this very reason, North Dakota, in their regulation of air ambulance memberships, they just flat out prohibited them. They were finding out that there were too many companies selling memberships statewide, but they would only service the Red River corridor on the eastern side of the state, things like that. So they flat out prohibited them. We would be able to look at the material given to the consumer to ensure that it's clear, that they know that if you have company A with the membership, and that may be the only company that's going to pick up any of your excess costs, and you're aware of that. We're also going to look at the financial viability of a company. Just yesterday, we talked to a consumer who bought a 25-year plan. I've talked to consumers who have purchased lifetime plans. Personally, I think if a consumer purchases something, has a contract that long in duration, someone needs to look at the companies to be sure they're going to be around for a few years to make good on their promise. Next, obviously, we'll help consumers with any complaints. They might have a complaint against the company. They might have a complaint against misleading material. They might have a complaint against an agent. And is a really, I think, an excellent example of where we can help consumers with the licensing process is The one company that is licensed, we had a complaint. And so we were going, a person went to one of these seminars, you get dinner and they tell you all about the product. He thought some of it was misleading. And so we called up the company and they were exceedingly responsive. And within 24 hours, they had tracked down the agent who sort of went off script, if you will, with the advertisements and the presentations. And the company made sure that agent knew better and documented training, where they're going to have that agent do more training, and they're going to be sure that that agent never made that mistake again. Now, if a company's not licensed, I have no authority to get involved in that sort of a thing to help them. Additionally, we also will look at the contracts between the consumer and the company. We will ensure that they comply with state law, among other things. And there's many requirements. In the insurance field, any documents that you receive, you can, if you're a consumer and you want to get them electronically, you can do that. But that is specifically your choice. You have to affirmatively agree to that. And that's a very important item in one of these contracts, because in Wyoming, we have an older population than most states. And some people's computers are very, very old and they don't have the software that would allow the receipt of electronic documents. They may have a sporadic Wi-Fi. They may not have Wi-Fi. And in some instances, you know, we've seen companies in certain insurance areas just start sending electronic documents. Well, this is one of those things we would be sure that certainly the consumer would only get that if they truly wanted it, and we'd be sure that it was in the contract to say that. As an FYI, obviously when that letter went out, and I will describe it as charitable as I can, I consider it factually challenged. And I'm trying to be nice there. We had 550 calls. I responded personally to 210, and the number's growing because I'm still getting a few more. Overall, though, it was an excellent experience, and this is why. Of the 550 phone calls, over 80% of them were people that had Medicare with a Medicare supplement plan. And majority of those consumers did not know, they did not realize that in fact, Medicare with a supplement plan will pay for medically necessary air ambulance transports. Now, I'm not a Medicare expert, and once I think probably after I made 10 phone calls and I started talking to all these seniors, we had people in our office call the experts. We actually called CMS, the regional office in Denver, and we asked them, you know, do you cover? Is this covered by, Medicare with a supplement plan? And if it's medically necessary, it's a senior citizen, it is covered. When I looked at the sheer numbers of seniors involved, you know, maybe the cynics in me came out, but I wondered if we were inappropriately targeting seniors. And I went back to being curious as to what information they were going to get. So I really am wanting to look at what data they're given. Is it clear that if they have a Medicare plan with a Medicare sup, that this coverage will not be needed? I just want to be sure that those consumers were not in fact being preyed upon and given misinformation. So that's just an overview. I know there's options you're looking for. I mean, at first blush for me, there's probably 3 options here that the legislature can look into. One is you leave it as it is. We have one company that in some ways could be viewed as earning the right to sell the product because they've complied with the licensing. The other option is to go back as to where we were a year ago and not have any regulation of this industry. And obviously the consumers wouldn't have any protections that we have talked about. There is sort of a middle ground, if you will. We also license and regulate, I guess license maybe not technically be the term, but we regulate extended warranty contracts. We regulate AAA, for example. They have to register with us. It's not as evasive it's not as difficult as getting a disability license. But in some ways, being a disability insurer is actually fairly accurate. I mean, we're dealing with the delivery of medical services here, and they're certainly more expensive, and there's more, the cost is enormous. There's more on the line. It's not just like with AAA, getting your card back to the nearest mechanic. There's a whole lot more at stake here. And so some would say that maybe that is the better route to go. But there are options here. We were neutral on the initial legislation. We'll be neutral on whatever goes forward. We just want to deliver to you what the concerns are and what we can offer consumers and what the problems will be if those consumers aren't helped by our office. But I would be certainly happy to answer any questions that you have.
All right, well, thank you. Yeah, Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a few questions, and I really appreciate that background, Commissioner. I learned a lot from that discussion just now. The first is, what was the timeline? Can you remind us of the timeline in terms of how long they had to apply for or fill out the forms and get themselves regulated, so to speak, get the application in?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, I believe, well, actually, the industry itself, air ambulance and representatives were part of the process with Representative Barlow when this was first passed 2 years ago. Ultimately, then it went into effect. And that's one of the things that was so misleading about the letter. It made it sound like it was just an instantaneous change. But the fact is, they knew about this for quite some time, and it didn't go into effect until 1 April of 2020. And the letters to the consumers went out about 10 days prior to that implementation date. So there's been time. I mean, there's plenty of time to do this. The one company that went ahead and was licensed, they started. Oh, I want to say they waited until last fall, September, October, and they were licensed right at 1 April, right when the law went into effect.
Okay, follow up.
Yep, go ahead, Senator.
Follow up, thank you. How many, what's the count here? How many companies sort of did we start with? And I know that we've only got one that's currently licensed. So what's the number that chose not to operate in Wyoming as a result of the change in policy?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, when we first started looking at this, we had heard there were 20 to 30 that could operate in Wyoming, but realistically only 8 or 9 that do. The one company that is licensed is a little different. They don't own aircraft. They don't employ doctors. They take a more traditional insurance approach in that they don't care who picks you up. They cover it. And I imagine they're more expensive because of that. But it doesn't matter where in the state you're injured, where in the state you go, that's their business model. But obviously, I think one of the attachments that you have before you is another company that actually chose not to get licensed because they didn't believe it was necessary. They also, I think they were fairly clear that they thought that this was the right road to go down regarding regulation. But so the short answer is 8 to 9 probably are actually out there that have not been licensed.
Okay, one more question, Mr. Chairman, then I'm done, I think. Do you have any sense, did you look at the practices of these entities that chose not to continue operating in Wyoming to understand where they would be non-compliant? I mean, effectively, the regulation seems like a consumer protection. So for me, that raises a little bit of a red flag that if these companies are choosing not to operate, then there must be something about their practices that doesn't withstand that scrutiny, but I don't know. So I was wondering if you have any insight into why they would say, well, if they're going to regulate, we're not going to do it.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, I'll speculate if you allow me to. I think there's a couple issues out there. One is, given the deregulation of airlines, they haven't been regulated in the past and they've won in court. And so there's an initial reaction not to want to be regulated in any way, shape, or form. There's also a pending case on appeal involving North Dakota. It's Guardian versus Godfrey. Godfrey is the commissioner of North Dakota. The case cited with the air ambulance company saying that the state couldn't force them in network, if you will. But the court then ruled that this is insurance. This is a shifting of risk. And it meets the basic definitions of insurance. And you can call it a membership if you want. You can call it whatever you want, but it's still subject to regulation. And so the air ambulance company lost on that, and it's under appeal. And I suspect they might be waiting for that result of that appeal to come out, because that would certainly change the landscape to some degree.
Okay, committee, any committee members, other committee members have questions? Okay, so I have a couple on that with respect to the, oh, go ahead, Representative Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, the one that company that we've all been getting letters from, were there other companies, or was it mainly just this one that in your research, were there other ones, or was it just this one that was the main culprit of that was problematic?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Duncan, are you referring to the letter that generated the phone calls? Okay. That was the only letter that we received, but we also noted on many of the websites of the air ambulance companies, if you go to their national website to sign up, you would click Wyoming, and some of them would say statements that were somewhat, once again, factually challenged, but they would say, you need to call the department because they just did this and they're taking your right away to buy a membership. And so there was that was out there also. But as far as letters go, it was truly the one that we all received that I was responding to.
Okay. Any other questions, committee members? So I do want to ask Commissioner, it's my understanding that the company that is licensed, they weren't originally licensed in Wyoming, they're licensed in another state, and I can't think of the term, but so they went through a shorter process than someone doing an initial licensing or first licensing. Is that right?
Well, Mr. Chairman, you're right that I mean you've got to have your business somewhere, and so you've got to either say I'm a Wyoming business, I'm going to get a Wyoming license, or you say in this case I'm a Florida company, I've got my Florida license, and I want to, in essence, apply as a domestic company. And this happens all the time with insurance companies. We only have 4 domestics, but we license over 1,400 to do business in the state. So they're licensed by somebody. So what we then do is we looked at that license and we contacted the insurance department of Florida and said, what in your regulatory capacity do you do? And we made sure it complied with our requirements. And some of the requirements were not there in Florida. And we had to talk with them, and the company agreed, no, we're okay, that's fine, we'll do this. We'll provide this information even though Florida wouldn't normally do it, and things like that. So there's 2 ways of doing the licensing process, either here as a Wyoming company or somewhere else where you're licensed.
Okay, yeah, no, thank you. And then in the company that's currently licensed, you said they operate like a true insurance company. That is, they your costs are covered and they do not bill back to your primary insurance, or do they?
Mr. Chairman, my understanding is they cover what your insurance company won't.
Okay, okay. All right. Okay. No, I think that's all I had. I just wanted to make sure I was clear on those. Okay. So Commissioner, if you just hang around for us in case we got any more questions for you, we would really appreciate that. So, okay, committee, what I think I'll do is we'll let Richard Mincer, if he can turn his camera on. He is an attorney representing one of the companies affected by this. Mr. Mincer, please introduce yourself, who you represent, and please feel free to tell us what you need to tell us.
Okay. Good afternoon, committee. My name is Richard Mincer. I'm an attorney with Hearst Applegate down in Cheyenne. I do represent the company that sent the letters. I also represented air medical providers, both in the workers' comp lawsuit from a while ago, and was also involved at the legislature and with the Department of Health in the work that was, that was done towards trying to get a waiver from CMS. A couple of things that I wanted to mention. I was most prepared to talk about this membership issue, but I can get into some of the other stuff if you would like. With respect to the membership issue, Senator Rothfuss was accurate that this was not a part of the bill, quite frankly, that I think anyone paid attention to, including the companies, legislators, and everyone else. And I think everyone suspected, or at least I know I did, and if I was wrong, I'm guilty of this, that if the Medicaid for All plan did not receive CMS approval, that this would fall by the wayside, either be repealed or something. For one reason, because the effect of this membership limitation is to not combat balance billing, but to make sure that more Wyoming citizens are going to receive balance bills and also co-pays and other things than they would have before. So, this part of the bill standing alone without the Medicaid part achieves the exact polar opposite of the intention of the legislature in trying to pursue the CMS part. One other thing that I wanted to mention, I spent a lot of time with the Joint Labor Committee in both the House and the Senate. There are a lot of factual misconceptions out there that seem to have been accepted as fact. One I'll throw out is, again, something Senator Rothfuss mentioned about people being forced into bankruptcy because of air ambulance bills. I encouraged the Department of Health to look into that when they were working on the waiver plan. Never heard anything back on an actual statistic. Now, that may have been true years and years ago. I don't think it's true anymore. So one thing just to throw out in general, there are a whole lot of factual misconceptions, a lot of that came out of the press, some came out of the insurance industry that were just never factually backed up. As to this specific provision on requiring registration as an insurance company, it's important to appreciate that registering as an insurance company is not as simple as just filling out an application. We've got an entire title of the Wyoming statutes devoted to insurance regulation, and for good reason. I mean, there's a reason to regulate insurance companies. When a letter came out in January of 2020, I believe it was, saying that yes, indeed, this part of the legislation is going to remain active and you need to register. And I called Senator Rood and said, we would like to try to find some kind of middle ground, but we're not an insurance company. We don't sell insurance. We're not registered as an insurance agency in any other state or an insurance company in any other state. Is there something we can do that would find some middle ground and provide some consumer protection without having to register as an insurance company? And as the commissioner just described, there's really two ways to register as an insurance company. One is to be an insurance company that's registered in another state, and then you get some form of reciprocity with that. Or you have to have a brick and mortar, establishment as an insurance company in Wyoming. And the reality for our company was it was impossible to do either one of those. So we didn't. We quit selling memberships in Wyoming. As we, told members about it, we got blowback as well. Well, there was really nothing we could do about it. So, we're not going to become an insurance company overnight or in a month or probably ever. So that was when we suggested that you should call a representative. And obviously, because Representative Barlow and Senator Scott were the chairs of the labor committees, that's why we mentioned them. I've since heard in talking to other legislators, that's probably not the smartest idea to call out legislators by name, and I get it. But let me explain to you why this isn't insurance, at least in the case of my client. Insurance, and there's a lot of federal cases on it, and the courts talk about the business of insurance, and there's plenty of law on it. And that's why, by the way, we think the North Dakota decision is almost assured to get reversed. But the business of insurance is when you spread risk. It's like you think of in a typical insurance situation where you pay premiums, you do actuarial studies, and you have to have a certain amount in reserve, in accordance with the law, to make sure that you're financially able to pay any claims that come up. The difference with these memberships, at least in the terms of my client and several of the others impacted, is that you're not paying third-party claims. All you're doing is you're telling the consumer that for this amount of money, which is $85 a year for an entire household, and in some cases less for group policies, if you fly on one of our aircraft, then you will not receive a bill from us. And you don't even have to pay your copay. So whether, we've been talking about Medicare and insurances and is it covered? Well, you've got copays, you've got amounts you have to pay. And then you also have a number of insurance companies who will only pay a certain amount towards their ambulance. When the Department of Health had its listening tour back the summer before last, and we went up to both Riverton and Casper, and then I think there's one here in Cheyenne, the stories that we were hearing from consumers was about insurance companies who would only pay $10,000 and that was their limit. Well, the insurance company knew that $10,000 wasn't going to cover the cost of a flight. And there's been, a lot of accusations about the air ambulance providers not wanting to go in network. Those accusations have to flow both ways. I mean, obviously the insurance company and the air ambulance company are going to have to agree if they're going to go in network. And a lot more of that has improved in the last couple of years than before. But so the reality was everybody wanted to blame the air ambulance companies for the balance bills, where the reality is somebody's been paying their insurance premium for their entire life. And now when they've got an emergency, they're left in a lurch because it isn't paid completely. But I kind of flew off on a tangent there. I'll get back to why it's not insurance. But the point again being that all the memberships are doing is they are saying for our company, and in our case, Air Medcare Network has affiliated companies under the same, general corporate ownership across the country. So if you're flown by one of our aircraft, then you don't pay anything. And I think anybody who's looked at the materials that are provided to consumers will see that that's very adequately and clearly disclosed. I don't know that we've had any complaints. I'm not entirely sure what the problem was, but I'm not saying there wasn't because I don't know what everyone else did. Now, the difference, there's been a lot of talk about the one company that has registered. Well, they did register in Florida. And one thing I'll throw out, and Commissioner Rood probably knows the statistics better than I do, but I think there's only 3 or 4 states in the country that try to regulate air ambulance as insurance. It's something extremely new. This company was apparently licensed in Florida. There was a question asked earlier about whether they paid everything or only what was left over after the patient's primary insurance paid, and you heard the answer to that. I think another question, I don't know the answer to it, I've just heard stuff anecdotally, is do they pay everything or do they only pay a certain amount? I don't know the answer to that. But the point is that this company is paying third parties. They're paying, they're paying other air ambulance companies. So when there were, comments, questions from various representatives, about some of the concerns or perhaps the need for this legislation, one thing that came up is that we should make sure that these companies have reserves to pay their claims. Well, in an insurance context, that's certainly true. But if you're not paying claims, that's not really a concern. I mean, obviously, with any business, you want a business to be, financially sound, but that's not something that the state jumps into and regulates. So when you've got a company like ours and all we are doing is waiving a bill then there shouldn't be a concern about whether there is adequate reserves. With our company, we're one of the 2 largest in the world. I think that's fine, but I think, obviously the legislation goes beyond us. So anyway, the point being, it's not insurance, and it shouldn't be regulated as such. Now, one of the things that I did do when I talked to Commissioner Rood was ask, if there was some other way to get to a point to provide the consumer protection. Nebraska has a statute that does require a registration. It's not, it would be more in the realm of regulation light. It's not as onerous as the insurance statutes. I did provide Commissioner Rood with a copy of our certificate from Nebraska, but it was rejected, and granted, it, in his defense, it did not meet the language of the statute. And I think, largely that's where we are right now as far as this goes, is we have a number of people, as you've heard from personally, who are happy with the product. It's very affordable. It provides a method to protect yourself against balance bills in some circumstances. You're right. One of the drawbacks is it's not insurance. So it's not going to pay anytime they're picked up somewhere else. I think what we see, I haven't studied it closely, but what I suspect is that, and we do have a number of bases in Wyoming, I think we will tend to get more memberships from a county or an area where we have a base, than we will otherwise. But even despite what it does in Wyoming, it's also providing an element of coverage. I shouldn't say coverage, it's not insurance, but you're covered nationwide, again, if you are flown by one of the affiliated companies. So it's a limited product. It's not insurance. I think we're confident that that's the way the court decision will ultimately come out. But the question is there a way to provide some consumer protection that I think this committee and the legislature wants to do without making it such that, that you're telling a company that is not in the insurance business that you need to register as an insurer. And I think that's the problem. That's why we quit selling memberships in Wyoming. I think I assume, I don't know what the other companies are doing, but you've heard you've only got one who registered, and they in fact act much more like an insurance company than any of the rest of them. We would like to find some middle ground, but the way it sits is just not something we can operate under. And I guess I would take questions from there. I'm starting to repeat myself some, so I'll stop.
All right, committee, any questions? Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mincer, if you don't want to be regulated as an insurance entity, and I understand your arguments to that extent, my question would be, what do you want to be regulated as?
Well, I think is virtually any
question. What would be acceptable? Nobody wants
I was going to say,
regulated.
As most Wyomingites, I'd probably say I don't want to be regulated at all. I think, well, let me back up and give a little bit more complicated, and then I'll get to that. One of the problems that is theoretically on the horizon with any regulation is that you got the Airline Deregulation Act. So if you're regulating rates, routes, or service, then that's going to be preempted by the ADA. The question is, if it truly is insurance, then the McCarran-Ferguson Act reverse preemption would apply. That's the issue in North Dakota and everywhere else.
Yep.
What would be acceptable, and I think what would help both the industry and the consumers, is taking a look at the materials, how some of this stuff is sold. Is there a disclosure in the materials that tells the consumer what the limitations are? Like I mentioned earlier, our materials, if you've looked at them, I know at least some have, put that right out there. The concerns, like there was mentions of senior citizens, I don't know all the facts behind that. I think one thing that you would have to look at, though, is yes, Medicare may cover it, but what kind of copay do you have with Medicare? Maybe somebody knows Medicare better than I do. I know I've heard a number of like $1,500 or something like that. So I think the answer is drill down into the details, figure out, is there a problem that needs to be regulated? And if so, what is it? Based on facts, not based on rumor accepted as facts, and then address it. And I think that's the kind of thing that my client would be on board with. Obviously, the more heavy-handed it is, the more it seems to run afoul of the ADA, the more concern it is. But I don't think we're interested in, filing a lawsuit on the ADA for every regulation that comes along. There's some sensible stuff out there. There's some middle ground that we can agree to, like we did in Nebraska. So I think something like that could be workable.
Oh, follow up, Mr. Chairman. Well, my understanding going back a few years, and I have no idea if you were involved in it or not, but just talking anecdotally to Majority Leader Barlow and Senator Scott, there was a lot of outreach when these concerns were raised about very high balance billing incidents. I don't have firsthand knowledge. So as far as the anecdote versus fact, that is something I'm curious about also. I would like to see data. I would like to see follow-up, and I'll do that. I'll take some time to try and reach out and learn more about that. But what I understood was the ADA is so incredibly powerful and sweeping that there was resistance from industry to show up and talk to our Labor Health Committee because there really wasn't anything that could be done by the state of Wyoming. That was effectively the impression that those co-chairmen at the time had, that industry just didn't really feel obligated to show up and talk to Wyoming. So I think there's a lot more communication now. And I don't know that we have it right, but I still don't know, based on your answer, what type of industry you should be regulated as, or how we would go about that type of consumer protection, because really that's one of the roles we have as a legislature. We look out for our constituents. I want to make sure that my constituents are treated fairly by businesses and that there isn't any fraudulent behavior and that they get the value that they've invested in, and that value doesn't vanish at some point as a result of bad investment or whatever the case is. Those are my obligations on behalf of my constituents. So I think it's pretty clear we can't regulate through the ADA. I'm convinced at this point. A lot of people have tried and nobody has succeeded. But if not that, then really, I'd appreciate, and you might not have it right now, but I'd appreciate a hard and specific answer on how we can address these consumer interests and make sure that our constituents are being treated fairly and they're getting the value out of their dollar. And if we can't do it and call you an insurance company, what would you like us to call you?
Let me give you a couple parts. I've been involved in a lot of this for many years, starting with the very beginning of the workers' comp lawsuit. Mm-hmm. There was not a lot of outreach. We were the enemy. The outreach that started, though, before the lawsuit ever got filed, us and Air Methods, and at the time it was Eagle Med and MedTrans, along with Air Methods, we reached out to the Workers' Comp Division. We flew in people and brought them to Cheyenne, and we said, look, you can't win this lawsuit. You cannot cut the rates like this and win this lawsuit. But we would be happy to talk with the division to try to find some middle ground to where, basically go in network with the comp division. And at that point, which was probably 5 or 6 years ago, we thought we were getting to a place pretty close when the division and the AG told us no. Let's go to the lawsuit. So we did. From that point on, when the first bill came out, the one that was going to make the workers personally responsible, The first we heard of that was shortly before it happened. And then, of course, the one that eventually passed, wasn't a committee bill. It was something that was introduced at the last moment. So that's that part. As to the regulation, again, I think my big point would be, and I agree with everything you said, I think you should be protecting citizens. I mean, I'm a citizen. I want it too. But I think the question is there a problem somewhere that needs to be regulated? Or is this just a case of let us find some way to regulate the air ambulance companies because of everything that's happened in the past? I don't know what the answer is as to what we should be regulated as, because quite frankly, I'm not a legislature and don't know the statutes as well as you do. But I do think there is room for some regulation to provide the consumer protections that are necessary without going as far as saying you have to register as an insurance company. If I knew what you wanted to address, for example, if I knew what the actual problems were, if we knew that there were some companies out there who were taking advantage of citizens, I feel pretty confident that's not us. And at least, from our standpoint, that's pretty easy to get on board with. Because like I say, I think that helps the good actors in the industry as well as protect the citizens.
One more follow-up, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, and then Representative Crankle gets.
Yeah. Well, just to address that point, I mean, you just think through it. We've got a captive audience, so to speak, circumstance where the rate cannot be influenced in any way by the state of Wyoming. So you've got somebody who's injured at the side of the road that doesn't even have the capacity to say, yes, I accept medical provision, or no, I don't. That individual might end up with a $100,000 bill. I believe there was a circumstance, and again, I don't know this firsthand, but I read it in the news, a $120,000 bill associated with an air ambulance evacuation from an accident. Those are exactly the kind of things that we regulate and typically try to regulate because this is an individual that did not get to enter into that contract willingly, so to speak. So if you want to know what we're looking at, it is balance billing, an incredibly high cost of billing if you don't have any insurance available, which is what we're always looking at. So it's no different from our perspective than insurance, but I do understand all of your arguments. I see your point, but when we look at it, it looks a lot like insurance for those reasons, I think. So do you have any thoughts on maybe how we could then proceed towards how do we address balance billing and how do we address exorbitant costs associated with it when you don't have a willing acceptance of the contract, so to speak?
But the costs of the service, Senator Rothfuss, are separate and distinct from selling memberships.
And I mean, and tell me, Mr. Chair, Senator Rothfuss, whoever, tell me how deep you want to go into all of that here. I'd be happy to talk to you separately. We can talk about an hour about the cost of services. These things are flying emergency rooms. They are probably the best equipped medical facilities that we have in the state of Wyoming, or pretty doggone close. They are not cheap. Two, one thing that could be done is work with insurance companies to not force their own insureds to pay so much. I mean, one of the stories that I heard from Representative Barlow at one of the meetings, and I may have the facts a little wrong, but it was something like one of his constituents got a $100,000 bill and the insurance company paid $2,000. If anything, that shows you need to work it from both ends. I have had two different cases for individuals who had good insurance with one of the two good insurance companies here in Wyoming. In both cases, one time it was my air ambulance client, another time it was a different provider. In both cases, they were in network. Sounds like a perfect situation. Everything ought to be taken care of. In both cases, the insurance company completely denied the bill, saying it wasn't medically necessary.
Right.
So that's another big problem. It happens a lot. So there are a number of different ways to work it. The other biggest problem is, even with that, even with insurance companies, you've got problems because so many of them are ERISA plans, and you got the same preemption problem with ERISA plans that you do here. And then the last thing I'll throw out about that is there have been efforts at the federal level to try to rebase the Medicare rates. This is one of the key issues in all of this if you're talking about billing. 60 to 70% of the patients that air ambulance companies fly, on those 60 to 70%, they are compensated somewhere around half the cost of flying those patients. And that's because the Medicare rates have not been rebased since the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
It is different than what Medicare does with all other healthcare providers. And in fact, as I understand it, I'm not involved in the federal efforts, but as I understand it, the industry has been asking Congress to make them share, make them do all the stuff everyone else does and rebase those rates. So I think the reality is when you're looking at that level of care that is so underpaid, either because of uninsurance, Medicare, Medicaid, the reality is the other 30% are left holding the bag for what the others don't pay.
Mm-hmm. All right. In the interest of time, Mr. Chairman, I'll just stop now.
Okay. Representative Crank?
Can you hear me, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't want to beat this horse too much anymore. But just for my personal, so if I buy a subscription or what you call a membership, I pay $85 a year, I get flown for nothing. But if I don't have a membership and your same chopper comes in and picks me up, I could get a bill for $60,000. Is that what I'm hearing?
Only if, I mean, that membership, yeah, what you're saying is right. But if it's our membership, it's our planes. If you buy our membership and someone else flies you, well, then we're not insurance, we're not paying for that claim. And vice versa. If you buy someone else's membership and we fly you, same kind of thing. But one thing I do want to mention too, that goes to a lot of what's been said, is that certainly I know the big air ambulance companies, us, Air Methods, I think Classic, who's I think more regional, but pretty active in Wyoming, all have patient advocacy services. And so what happens is when their insurance company doesn't pay as much as they should, or even doesn't pay a reasonable amount, or doesn't pay for medical necessity, you've got a lot of air ambulance companies who are working on behalf of the patient to try to deal with the insurance company and get coverage straightened out. That's not happening from the insurance side. And the other reality is, and I can't remember the exact number, but I know we talked about it back with Department of Health, the average amount that air ambulance companies get reimbursed per flight is somewhere in the $13,000 to $15,000 range. Now, obviously, you know, when you think about averages, you got to factor in all of that lower. But the point is, a lot of the things that you hear, a lot of the stuff about bankruptcy, and I got a $100,000 bill that I've got to pay, you always want to ask, you know, as Paul Harvey said, the rest of the story and find out how it ended at the end of the day. Sorry to go off on a tangent, Representative Crank.
No problem. Just a little bit of follow-up then. So you said you're not an insurance carrier company because you don't pay claims, but you do make claims that can be rather exorbitant. So I'm still not tracking why you're not providing insurance with your policy.
We're not providing insurance because we are not technically spreading risk. It's like a gym membership. If you buy a gym membership at Gold's, you can probably go to Gold's anywhere in the country, but that doesn't give you the right to go to Fitness One or something like that. Or you can also equate it to prepaid medical. If you do one of these prepaid medical plans, you go to a certain provider and your certain services are covered. The claims that are being made is simply that the patient will submit the claim to their own health insurance company and they'll pay whatever they pay. And then the air ambulance company will waive any other recovery, including the copay.
Does that help,
Which-
Representative Crank? You good? Okay. Representative McGuire had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and this has been very interesting. The problem is, and this is a letter that I received from one of my constituents who lives on the east side of Casper. That particular person happens to be elderly, has Medicare with a supplement specifically that covers air ambulance. The closest provider is in Riverton. Now, when this individual went to the dinner where she was sold this policy for $187 a year, I don't know where the 85, I don't know who's getting the extra $102, but for $187 a year is what she's paying. You're telling me, well, the salesman completely glossed over the fact that a helicopter is not going to dispatch from Riverton, fly past the helicopter that's stationed in Casper to go pick her up, and then fly back to Casper. That is just not going to happen. And that's why this needs to be regulated. It is insurance. You can argue semantics all day long, but I will take you, anytime you want. We can argue about the definition of insurance. You are spreading risk. This is not a gym membership. This is not an all-you-can-eat coupon card or anything else. You're spreading risk and you're selling it to people, and they are presuming that when they buy it, that they're going to be covered, and they're not going to be. The people who live in Casper and other parts of the state that aren't within the circle of coverage of your 5 or 6 helicopters that are stationed around the state are not going to be covered. And it needs to be regulated because, I mean, there's just all kinds of different examples that I can give of people who are buying something and they're not getting what they think they're getting. And that's why there's an insurance commission. And that's why people are licensed, and that's why people are regulated. And it's no different than an attorney. If somebody came here to the state of Wyoming and started advocating and going to a court of law, you would be the first one to go to the Bar Association and file a complaint. And well, you should.
So do you have a question, Representative McGuire? We try to ask questions.
You're right. I forgot my question. My apologies, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Give you a little leeway, I understand, but yeah.
And I do have a question. I mean, I think that's a valid concern, Representative McGuire. Was that one of my clients? If it's 187, it doesn't sound like it. But that was one of the things I mentioned earlier, was that if you have,
Well, okay, let's get back to, let me control the meeting, please, okay? So,
okay.
All right. Committee, any further questions of Mr. Mintzer? Okay, thank you. All right, Mr. Mintzer, we'll have you also just out of courtesy, just hold tight with us. And then I didn't know if Commissioner Franzen wanted to comment. He's a commissioner from Washington County, where we have a unique situation. I don't know, Fred, if you're available.
I am, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
So I guess I really don't have so much comment there on that part, but I'd like to introduce myself a little bit to some of the other members, Mr. Chairman, if that's okay. My name's Fred Francis. I'm the chairman of the Washakie County Commissioners, and I'm also a co-chair for the Wyoming County Commissioners Association on the Safety, Health, and Social Services Committees. And I'd like to get some background here and some facts. In 2017, Guardian Flight began offering memberships in the state of Wyoming to the residents through Air Medcare Network. Since that time, Air Medcare Network has transported 872 members with Wyoming address, saving the residents more than $5.8 million. In 2019 alone, Guardian Flight completed a total of 1,262 flights of all Wyoming residents, an average of 3.5 flights per day. Of those, 142 flights were members, saving those residents $1.1 million. Without membership under the newly imposed regulations, Wyoming residents would be financially responsible for all the copay deductibles and the balances resulting from rendered air medical transport services and any surprise insurance denials. We pay, or the annual 85 membership that they charge covers everyone in that household, and that means if they need to be flown to emergency medical care, they will not receive a bill for that flight. Washakie County joined the air ambulance in 2015. All of Washakie County residents what that membership means to the residents of Washakie County is no out-of-pocket expenses if they unfortunately required a life flight. Plus, our residents are covered wherever our air ambulance company provides service, as we've talked or heard testify on. If we use the lowest figures that House Bill 94 in 2019 used of $20,000 or $25,000 per flight, and there were an average of 5 Washakie County residents life flighted each month, that's a total of $1.5 million. And if all 60 had health insurance with a deductible of $2,000, then it would save our residents $120,000. However, most insurance companies have a cap on what they will pay for a life flight. Confusion around this has led to issues where patients think they are covered, but following emergency situations, they find themselves stuck with a hefty bill that oftentimes they can't pay for. Is there a need for some regulations? It sounds like it. I don't know what that is, but I can tell you it's not as an insurance company. Something nearly all of these life flight type providers note is that this coverage is meant as an addition versus in lieu of an existing insurance policy. The low membership fees are meant to cover expenses that health insurance companies won't otherwise cover. Insurance is a practice or an arrangement by which a company or a government agency provides a guarantee of compensation for specific losses, damage, illness, death, or return of payment or for a premium. Life flight companies cannot guarantee coverage. They are dependent on the weather and their availability. And that is stated in our contract with our provider that we have. My hope is the Wyoming legislature will repeal the law passed in 2019 that says air ambulances must be a disability insurance, because clearly they are not an insurance company. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner. Any questions for Commissioner Franzen? Okay. Sort of, Commissioner, in Washakie County, the county pays for all of us. So I don't have any fee. If I have a heart attack, which could happen since we're doing Zoom meetings here, I know I'm going to get flown to Casper or Billings, and it doesn't cost me a thing.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Any other? Okay. Did Representative Burkhart, do you raise your hand or not? Okay. Very good. I guess we'll move on. Is Brian? Is there anyone else out there that was set up to testify? These three gentlemen were who I had on the list.
Mr. Chairman, I didn't have anyone else.
Okay. Well, then I'm going to close public testimony for now, and again, Commissioner Rude, Richard Mincer, and Commissioner Franz, and thank you. interesting subject, especially for the Minerals Committee, to say the very least. But we'll get a fresh look at it. So, okay. Well, committee, what are our thoughts here? I mean, this is what I'm hearing, because this works so well in my county that I was all for, hey, this just go back to the way it was. Although I understand the consumer protection side of this. Do we want to look at this further, see if there's a regulation light? Do we want to revoke it? I mean, I think the Commissioner Rude set out the three options very well. We could all do nothing. We could revoke, go back to the way we were. Representative Crane.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I think we could possibly regulate them under the new gaming commission.
Well, that's quite funny for an engineer. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 people on the call here. Yeah, Senator Rothfuss.
Mr. Chairman, honestly, I think we should wait and see what the result of the court case is before we take action. I don't know what the timeline is on that, but it makes sense.
I don't know if I'm comfortable with that. But yeah, okay. Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not comfortable with waiting either. To me, it seems there's an emergency aspect to this, an emergency response where, like was said earlier, the patient or the victim, the person doesn't have the wherewithal, the presence to make a reasoned decision in those circumstances. And if you're a highway patrolman and you come up on a scene and you have to make a split-second decision whether to get that person to a hospital or not, what are you going to do? I'm get on the phone. If it's me, I'm going to get on the radio and say, hey, send a helicopter. But I like what I'm hearing about Washakie County, and maybe this is an opportunity here to take a little closer look at it, from a larger perspective, and see if there might be some opportunity for the rest of the state to consider what's going on in Washakie County and so on. The other side of it, is the elective side of it. And the sky's the limit there. It could go through the roof. So I would be in favor of pursuing this in a deeper context as we wait for this court decision to transpire. That's going to happen whether we do anything or not. But let's not lose the opportunity to make sure we're doing something productive in preparation for those folks out here who are paying the 187 or the 85 or whatever it is in the anticipation of having something to keep them from going bankrupt if an accident occurs. That's my 2 cents.
Okay, Brian, you had a comment?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, just a note about this case. I'm not especially familiar with the details of the case, the timeline of the case. I would note though that coming out of North Dakota, the case would be heard at the 8th Circuit.
Right.
So it would not be any decision that court issues would not be binding on Wyoming. It may very well be persuasive, but it wouldn't be binding unless that court were appealed to the United States Supreme Court and a decision was issued there.
Mr. Chairman, that's a good point. I actually take back that comment because of the district difference.
Yeah. Okay, I thought I saw somebody else with a hand. Was that? No, nobody else. So, okay, well, I guess, committee, do we want to, we've got 3 options. So if everybody sits silent, it means we leave this alone and Senator Case and I fight this individually, which is fine. Or do we want to look at, is there some middle ground regulation? Because in my mind, this is different, but Senator Wassenberger.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I
I guess I'm going to step out and move for regulation light and hope for a second.
Okay, it's seconded by Representative Henderson. Representative Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just a point of clarification. So regulation light, is that the middle ground? Or is that more to the regulation side of middle ground?
Well, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
What my hope is that it doesn't seem to me that air ambulances and these corporations that have developed are insurance companies, but they still need to be regulated in some way. And so how we do that and in what way we do that would be up to the committee. But you know, there's areas in Wyoming, Niobrara County specifically, that they have no coverage. And it'd be a neat thing if we could somehow protect all the citizens, people out of Arvada, Claremont, like you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, yes.
You know, I mean, that are so remote that we need to step up and at least do something. And I think regulation light or the middle ground might be the best solution for us at this time. And of course, that's left up to the committee.
You know, what I have heard going through this is that the good operators are not afraid of some registration or some regulation that requires proper disclosures. You know, as Representative McGuire, I mean, he's describing like what I'm just going to say is a high pressure sales situation. They go to a seminar and they're pressured into buying a membership. It's not a good thing. But likewise, so Nebraska has a system in place. You heard Mr. Menser, he mentioned it a couple of times. I wish he would have maybe I should have asked him, should have elaborated on that. But I do have some copies of what they have in Nebraska. Maybe we could look at something like that, for example. Yeah, go ahead, Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I don't know if everyone on the committee's had an opportunity to read the proposal that was actually made to Center for Medicaid Services. And it was kind of a statewide Washakie County plan, really. It was that type of an approach, but trying to do it as the state and moderate the cost. And you can imagine if you're distributing across the state, you really are doing what insurance is supposed to be doing, which is aggregating risk and spreading that across the state, then trying to use some Medicaid funds. So I do think there are some great programs, and I envy your county's ability to implement a program like that. I wish Albany County did that and could do that. I think it's a neat program, but there's two separate concepts here. This is a really great program for Washakie County and some other places. And, oh, by the way, we have to have consumer protection. I don't know how we get to the point where we achieve both of those. I'm not averse to trying, certainly. I'm interested in the ideas, but I do know that while this is the first rodeo for the Minerals Committee on this topic, it's certainly not the first rodeo for this topic in the Wyoming legislature. And I think there's a reason for failure, and I hope it goes differently this time. I hope there is cooperation and collaboration between industry. I hope they come and they try and bring solutions if we end up going down this road and try and draft legislation. But regrettably, my expectation is a stiff arm and resistance. Hope I'm wrong.
Senator Coe.
It's probably a stupid question, Mr. Chairman, but what about, life flight helicopters that are operated by, like St. Vincent's up in Billings? I think Wyoming Medical Center operates their own helicopter deal. Am I wrong there? Would they be regulated as well under this particular guideline?
My understanding is that no, they're not, because they're not selling the memberships. It's the selling of the memberships, I think, that is a trigger. And I'm willing for somebody to tell me that's wrong, but that's my understanding. So yeah, for me, big issue with this. I mean, because it effectively takes away from my whole county, 90% of my constituents, a service that they have all benefited from and enjoyed. So it is that concern. Yeah, Senator Rothfuss.
And Mr. Chairman, I'll support this motion for that reason, honestly. You know, looks like it's working for you. Just because it hasn't worked for a lot of other people, I think your people should have a remedy.
Yeah. Representative Henderson?
You know, I'm most concerned about having something in place, not just for Washakie County, but for the rest of the state, for everybody, in terms of the capability for an emergency response. And I think that in and of itself makes it worth pursuing this to at least get it taken a look at closer as we go into the next session cycle. Older folks were mentioned. We're going to have a demographic change here in the state over the next 4 to 5, maybe 10 years. And I think we should be doing everything we can to be prepared for that and help people be prepared for that. So I'm all in favor of supporting something to take a step forward, especially for the purposes of an emergency response for those folks in those counties, communities that don't have the economic wherewithal to support a special situation on their own.
Well, that actually was the charge from Management Council, was a statewide plan. So Representative Duncan? Representative Duncan, you're froze with your hand up. Okay, we can't help what the internet does to us, right? Okay, there's Representative Duncan. You had a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For some reason, everybody froze but me.
Oh, it actually was the other way around.
I know, I got kicked out. So I guess my question is to the committee, or to those who were working on the previous bill. Did we duplicate or copy any other states on our previous attempts?
Go ahead, Senator Rothfuss. I just know what Eric told me.
No, honestly, that was a fully novel approach. That was a new idea. It got a hell of a lot of national attention because it was a very clever idea. And if only it had worked, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now.
I agree.
So, Mr. Chairman, I would fully support us moving forward, especially if, as you say, Nebraska's model is in place and seems like something that might be a possibility. Might be more palatable for the rest of the two houses if it's already in place and working.
Yeah, we can take a look at what they do in Nebraska. Another idea that I think Representative Barlow had told me was they had worked on regulation regarding prepaid medical expenses. Senator Coe, you may have to help me on this, but I believe it was a clinic in Powell that had a novel approach to healthcare, and they set up a regulatory, or we did set up a regulatory scheme that allowed them to basically sell like monthly subscriptions for healthcare type of thing. Does that ring any bells with anybody? Good. I'll go with Louts and then Rothfuss. Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, you sort of, I wish I could think of the name of that. It's a system that's used all over the country, and it's just coming to Wyoming. And actually, I've been to a couple medical seminars on it, and basically they have so many members, and they provide basic services to them and some minor procedures also for like the figures I saw was like $125 a month, and depending on the number of kids and stuff. But I can't think of the name, and Mr. Roth, maybe Senator Rothfuss can remember. It's a term for that the membership. It's a really neat deal actually.
Okay, yeah, Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, we passed legislation on that 7 or 8 years ago. It was some sort of a cooperative system. It was very limited in scope. I remember when we were working it, I actually wanted to expand it and make it broader, but I was under the impression that there were federal prohibitions to broadening it. I have absolutely no idea anything beyond that, though. But I think that was the problem, and I think it's worth looking into.
Yeah, Brian, you popped up. You had a comment.
Mr. Chairman, I think just to answer the question, I don't have it right in front of me, but I think there's language regarding it's a direct primary care agreement. You know, and I can, you know, depending on when the committee considers this, I can certainly provide that language and information.
Yeah, you know, it obviously would have a different name, but that's what I understand is a type of regulation that has a consumer protection and disclosures and so forth with it. I'm just throwing out some ideas of what we may look to okay. All right, any further discussion on that? What the motion was is we would proceed to look at regulation light. So for the air ambulance membership companies. Is that right? Okay, all in favor, raise your hand. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, those opposed? 1, 2, 3. Okay, well, we'll pass. We'll continue to take a look at that then. Okay, committee, we have one more thing, and that is Representative Burkhart's bill. Why don't we take a 10-minute break? This makes sure, I think, Brian, do we all have that bill draft sent by you here not too long ago?
Mr. Chairman, there should be a version 0.5, and I sent that out right before the meeting started around 8:30.
Okay, yeah, I see 828. So 20 LSO 0735 0.5. Okay, all right. Let's go ahead and break till
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Also, I sent out a hand-marked copy. It's basically the changes that Brian put in there, but you can see what I did with the changes. It's marked up in red. I thought that way you could just see what the changes were a little bit rather than having to compare two clean copies.
Okay,
so you should have that. It was sent out about the same time.
So then, what do you want to work from, Representative? Which one do you want us to have up?
Well, I'm going to work from my marked up copy so I can explain what I did.
Okay, then you would like us to follow along on your marked up copy?
Please.
Okay. And
So, Mr. Chairman, is that 0.4 bill we're working on? Is that your marked up copy?
Mr. Chairman, yes, it is.
Okay, so I came from Representative Burkhart at 8:32 this morning. And the Senator Joe said it's 0.04.
Revision.
I don't understand what you just said.
Mr. Chairman, what the title of the attachment should be is LSO or 20 LSO 0735 V 0.4 revision.
Okay. All right. All right. Let's take a quick break then. All right. Thanks. Okay, do we have a quorum? 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9. We do. 10. Thank you, Senator. Okay. All right. So Representative Burkhart, do you want Brian to explain this, or do you want to go through your changes? We did a pretty decent review yesterday. I'll leave it up to you.
Mr. Chairman, I would just go through my changes. I think we all have an idea of the concept here. And that I would ask Brian, he made a couple changes for wording and for readability. And as we get to those, I'll just let him interject where those are, if that's okay. And that. And so I don't plan to go through this line by line. I'll just go through the changes if it's acceptable to everybody. Okay.
To the committee. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, first changes are on page 5. Okay, and line 6, deleted and state. In discussions I had yesterday evening, there seemed to be some confusion as to if you leave state in there, it would preclude other things that the state has done. So and these are in findings, so I just deleted state programs, and I'll give you the logic to these as we go through. Then lines 12 and 13 deleted, particularly those businesses that have not previously been eligible for relief funding. Again, I added that in before, and I think it just confuses that, so deleted it just for clarity. And I'll take questions as we go. Page 6, line 18, capital B. There were some questions about what independently owned and operated meant. In thinking about that, I used what the Business Council is using for a definition of that, and changed it to is a publicly or privately owned business and not a government-owned business or a government entity. And there was some discussion of using publicly owned or privately owned. Publicly owned being a stock company, private is obviously owned by an individual or individuals. So I guess we could discuss that later if someone wishes. Okay, the next change is on page 7, line 12. So that it reads on March 31st, 2020, employed in Wyoming, not less than 100 full-time employees. Again, just clarification of where those people need to be employed at. Next change.
Mr. Chairman, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, go ahead.
And Mr. Chairman, this was a place where just, perhaps as a belt and suspenders approach in version 0.5, I also added the language, full-time employees whose work was principally performed in Wyoming, to just make that abundantly clear.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. Okay, next change on page 10. And what I did, there was some discussion of matching months to months. So indicated that would be loss of sales, revenues, or production in April and May of 2020. And the wording in version 5 is April 2020 and May of 2020 of not less than 25%, all of which, as compared to the corresponding sales, revenues, and production for the same months in 2019 as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic or business interruption due to closures. To make it clear that, just because a company has a bad year doesn't mean they get anything. It has to be due to the COVID pandemic. Page 11, line 9, just clarified, and this gets rid of the 3-year average thing so that it reads an eligible business's annual property tax assessment for 2019. Makes it clear. makes it shorter. I think it clarifies it.
And Mr. Chairman, if I may just here, I do just want to point out that the staff comment, the calculation of these stipends as compared to the 3 programs that this committee considered and ultimately placed in House Bill 1004. The calculation was tied to the amount of loss. This is a little bit different in that the amount of the stipend is calculated on something slightly different in terms of they're calculated on, either a property tax assessment amount or the gross payroll amount. And I think there could be a question raised in terms of, whether those calculations will comport with the permissible uses of the CARES Act funds.
Yeah, go ahead, Representative Burkhart, and then I just have a little follow-up on that.
Okay, so Brian, just a thought on that. If you eliminated the property tax and went strictly with payroll, would that conform with the CARES Act closer than what this does now?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Burkhart, I think it would, in that you've eliminated one option that isn't there. But then the question still, I think, remains is whether using the gross payroll from last year is going to be defensible in terms of, if these expenditures are reviewed by the Department of Treasury, whether it can be shown that that amount is indeed the COVID related losses that the business experienced.
So, as a thought, these are more, I'm not being demeaning when I say this, but these are more sophisticated businesses in that they have more staff. Can you just say just 25%? Because it is capped. Can we just say that they can prove their loss from 1 year to the next year? That's directly related to COVID, then that would be associated with the interruption in business. I don't know. I like the concept of them being tied into property tax and payroll in Wyoming, but I'm sorry, it's late in the day. I guess I'm rambling a little bit, but my recollection is the guidance provides for stipends to business for interruption to business as a direct relationship or caused by the health orders. So, I mean, do we need to just go back to that? Is that they have a 25% loss of their business, and then they would just have to show that it would be that amount of their interruption in their business as a result of the health orders not to exceed the cap of 1.5 million. So think about that. Representative Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And also remember these people weren't eligible for the PPP, and the PPP eligibility is payroll, utilities, and your mortgage or lease or rent. So those were acceptable expenses for the PPP.
But I think Brian's point's valid, is that we're going to use PPP dollars where it was a different federal program. And the CARES Act is we're funding with CARES Act dollars. So he's right, we need to be within the guidance or at least be aware of that. Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
And Mr. Chairman, Representative Duncan, the basis of this language in this bill draft is based on what was Section 3 in 1004. So on page 9, included in the list of eligible expenses and expenditures include payroll, business supplies, business equipment. So all of that would be contemplated. But this is just a question about the calculation of what that amount is.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah.
The other thing with the annual property tax assessment was merely to qualify the larger companies. It's hard to say a company over certain employment or anything else. This would be, again, on one end, we had companies that fell through the cracks that were small businesses. This is for the companies that fell through the cracks as large businesses. And all the property tax thing was a qualifier to say those with large property tax amounts generally are going to be larger employees. An alternative to that, it would be the gross payroll, mostly because there are some fairly large companies with large employment that don't have a lot of property. A large construction company, for example, may not have a large amount of property, but they'd have a large number of employees. So, I mean, I'm open to suggestions on it. In this section, you could say it's calculated as 25% of the eligible businesses' gross payroll.
Well, here's another idea, and see how this works. But, you know, we can say that the stipend amount shall be an amount equal to the actual loss the business incurred as a result of the COVID-19, but in no event shall it be more than the greater of, if you're trying to, of the property tax or the payroll, or $1.5 million, if you're trying to tie all that together somehow.
I think that works also.
Senator Rothfuss?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I talked to Representative Burkhardt a little bit about this concern that I have, and this is probably a good place to raise it when we're talking about the dollar value of a program like this. You mentioned that these are sophisticated corporations, and that is true. One of the concerns I have with this particular approach, and I guess there's two here, is the first, they could be profitable both years. They could be profitable this year and profitable last year, and still be eligible for a program based on the language that we have. It could just be a drop in profitability. So realistically, even though you're saying that this money needs to go towards something in a sophisticated corporation, of course, that's what they would say in the accounting practice it's going towards, but that just offloads more profit to stockholders, execs, and anybody else. Which, when you're thinking, I mean, sure, that's great, and it's always nice to get more money, but when you start thinking about how these dollars are best used, I think we're hard pressed to want it to be executive bonuses over direct employee payroll, where we know that there's a company that's on the verge of bankruptcy. So I have a concern there. I don't know exactly what the answer is. Representative Burkhardt, I think is interested in trying to find a solution to that. That's one concern. And the other really gets to a point that was earlier, which is ensuring that this is consistent with both the Constitution and the COVID direction of the funds. And I think we have to be a lot more narrow on how it can be expended and for what purpose, so that we're achieving constitutionality based on the legislature's objectives, and not just going with the AG's interpretation that everything's okay.
I think the USS Constitution has sailed, Senator. These programs.
All right.
I've actually visited that ship, which is an amazing ship.
It is. It is.
So I too have struggled with this. And I'll give you a good example is that it wouldn't take much for a swing in profitability for the company that I run to occur. And one scenario is less throughput. And so this year, as a result of COVID, I could say that the price of sugar has actually gone up with home consumption. I mean, so there's so many different factors there that it is difficult. Yeah. All right. Sorry. Go ahead, Representative Burkhardt.
So, Mr. Chairman and Senator Rothfuss, looking at page 9, when we list out those things that the stipend can be used for, I think that's a place we could look at of maybe being a little more specific on that it has to go to specific in Wyoming activities. And I think we can tighten up that language a little bit. I don't have anything off the top of my head to do that right now, but to me, that would be a place, and I drop down to E, where it says any other expenditure or expense related to, and I think, you know, tighten that up. I don't like I don't like any in terminology much at all. Just leaves things too open to me, whether it's this bill or other bills. And make it very specific that it can only go for specific things and leave out the language like other and any other expenses, etc. I think that might help with that discussion.
Yeah.
But I don't have any wording this moment.
You know, I think we're all, when we listen to, and I'll just go back to Sinclair's testimony, too, we heard from, is I think we all want to make sure that this is spent on payroll or reward or reimbursement for payroll. And even though money's fungible, it doesn't really matter, but I think it makes us feel better about it anyway. So, okay.
And Mr. Chairman, also, I understand that the Trona mines have also kept their people employed and would probably benefit from a program like this.
Yeah. So way off subject. So speaking of, not way off subject, but Holly Frontier is in the middle of revamping and laying off 200 employees, I read this morning.
Yes, I heard it was 400, Mr. Chairman.
Wow. Okay. It's just keep coming, don't they?
Yeah. So I think we could, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry. I think we could look at tightening up some wording and really give some thought to, you know, the issue of property taxes. Like I said, it originally started as a qualifier, and it didn't work out quite the way envisioned. So it's open for discussion. To me, the next.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, Mr. Fuller has.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, you know, just to clarify, you know, there's two separate issues here. You know, the first would be the definition of an eligible business, and within that definition, you know, there is reference to the number of employees as well as, you know, the amount of payroll or property taxes paid. So that, you know, is one issue. And then the question on page 11 is simply the calculation of the amount of the stipend that the business would get subject to the 1.5 million limit. So there's two separate questions there. I just wanted to clarify that. For purposes of, you know, discussion in 1004, there's no analog to this paragraph in that bill. It just simply sets a cap, and it's left to the business council to calculate the amount of losses up to that total for those programs.
That may be simplest in the end. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that they have to prove the losses and they're compensated up to that point. So moving along on page 13, we had talked on Romanet 10 of how we would handle it, because this says shall not award stipends to eligible business that receive PPP funding. There was some discussion of a preference rather than a specific shall not. For discussion purposes, I left it alone and just said shall not. I think it made it simpler. If you start with the preference, again, we're into the situation of how do you qualify that preference, and that Mr. Fuller and I talked and decided probably the best way, and it's still in here, is that all the applications have to be in by a certain date, and then the business council would make a determination of who to give the money to, which maybe I don't like that as much as just saying if you got PPP money, you don't get any of this. So then on would start on line 18 on Romanet 11, to clarify, and I believe it was Representative Ayer raised the question, just says an eligible business cannot receive a stipend for losses or expenses claimed under another program. They can still get the other program, but they can't double dip. And I think that's just for clarification to me. So I think that was it. Those were the changes I made. And I guess with that, we can discuss it. Brian, you have something, I think.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ryan.
Mr. Chairman, just one more point. This would be in section 3 for the appropriation. The language is slightly different in this program compared to the others, and this is based on language that my colleagues have worked on. And what would happen is, this money is reappropriated from the 1.25 billion. On or before September 15th, and this is on page 15, starting around line 7. So on or before September 15th, the Business Council would have to basically make an estimate of the amount of funds that it's spent, obligated, or believes will spend, and then any amount in excess of that estimate would be reappropriated to the governor and basically go to the other programs or priorities that are contemplated in Senate File 1001. So I just wanted to highlight that for the committee.
Yeah, okay. Okay, I guess the question before the committee, as we kind of talked, is do we want to do a bill draft on this? So,
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
And maybe I wasn't clear. I consider this to be a working draft. I don't consider this to be call it a formal bill draft at this time. To me, it's just a working draft for discussion and revision and all of that.
I'm glad you do that, because then I don't have to hurt your feelings by calling it a working draft. Yeah. So, because I think what we have to do procedurally is this committee has to vote that we want to move this forward. And if this moves forward, it's obviously would need to go into a special session queue. And we would have to figure out how we're going to work this bill with public comment and some of those things before the special session. So at least I want to hold to our procedure as much as we can, working bills. So is there a motion then to direct LSO to have a draft along the lines of what Representative Burkhart's presented as a working draft?
I'll move it.
Okay, so it's been moved by, and then we'll do the second by Senator Beitman. Okay. Any further discussion? Senator Rothfuss.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'm certainly not averse to working this bill and seeing a bill draft, so I don't have any problem with the motion, but just some conceptual ideas. I don't know if we need any of the findings in this bill. I think at most we could reference the prior findings, since they're not really new or different findings. So I think one thing that, I don't know if it's a friendly amendment or what Representative Burkhart's thoughts are on it, but I'd almost just delete section 1 right off the bat, not have to worry about it.
Mr. Chairman, I'd consider that friendly on the working draft. We just included it because it was in the other 3 bills, was the only reason.
I think we've already set the groundwork for that. Is that friendly with the second? Okay, I got a head nod, yes. Okay, no, I agree. That's a good point. Okay, any further discussion? Okay, let's go ahead and take a vote. Show of hands.
Get drafted.
So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Those opposed? And okay, 1, 2. Senator Wassenberg, I counted you twice, I think. So you're a no vote on it? You're an aye vote. Okay.
Yeah.
It passed regardless of how you voted. How's that?
And Mr. Chairman?
Senator Rothfuss.
Again, I'm not sure whether I end up liking this idea or not, but I certainly appreciate the work that's gone into it, and I think it's worth continuing.
Yeah, and Senator Rothfuss and I are on Management Council. We are, yet to figure out where we're going here. And, obviously, I think everything else that we've worked over the last 2 days can go through the general session just fine. Although I think some of the one bill, which I don't know how that'll ever work out, regarding directing the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission to dip heavily into the reserves, probably needs to go quicker to push them. The severance tax relief probably is one to go quicker as well. But this one definitely, it doesn't do any good to talk about it in the special session. The other two, at least, still they would have some effect. So I think we just got to figure out where we're at with that. So, Representative Burkhart.
Mr. Chairman, and I'll work with staff on this, but it'll go as we normally do bill drafts. If anybody else wants to help, that's a great idea.
Yeah. Okay. So, anything else from the committee? Well, let me ask this, Brian. Is there anybody out there for general comment? Or
Mr. Chairman, we didn't have anyone sign up.
okay. So I think if the committee's got any further comments, we'll take them. And then Brian, I think we'll wrap up with our subcommittee appointments and bill drafts. Just do a quick synopsis. So committee, anything from the committee? Okay, Brian, could you just kind of wrap us up on what we did?
You bet, Mr. Chairman. So first, a review of the partnership loan program and the business council statutes. This would be a subcommittee working with the business council and Chairman Greer, Representative Furphy, and Senator Coe.
Okay.
Second would be a severance tax bill draft that would reduce the severance tax for the production of crude oil for a 6-month period after the price reaches $45.
Okay.
Then a bill $7.5 million for the Oil and Gas Commission for orphan well projects. The short time compensation bill, which the committee considered. The 3 bills from the Division of Banking concerning trust companies, money transmission, and consumer credit code. The bill draft for the tax lien, a bill draft for the air ambulance regulation, and then the COVID large business bill draft. Of those, Mr. Chairman, the severance tax, the Oil and Gas Commission, the short time compensation, and I believe the COVID large business program are those that my understanding is the committee would like those prepared in anticipation of a potential special session.
I think that's correct. I realize that's a lot. And we may have to winnow that down just a little bit for what we can handle appropriately, and 2, what we would have time for. And so we can do that on what is the highest priority and do that at a later date. We'll figure that out. There were volunteers to ride herd on the banking commission bills. Just maybe mention those.
Yep, and Mr. Chairman, for the trust company amendments, I have Representative Furphy. For the money transmission, Senator Rothfuss, and the consumer credit, Representative Duncan.
Okay, thank you. Okay. All right. Anything else for the good of the committee?
And then, Mr. Chairman, I think the only other question would be if the committee would want to schedule or plan a meeting for some time later this month to consider these issues in anticipation of that special session.
Yeah, this wait till we get more information on that. Okay. And I'll tell you what, I'm as sensitive to our calendars as anybody. So this wait and see, find out what the schedule is for the whole legislature. And then we'll proceed from there. Again, I don't want a 2-day meeting. I'd sure like to avoid a 1-day meeting, but with that many topics, boy, it'd probably be a full day. So, okay. All right. Anything? Yeah, Senator Coe.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, can I ask Representative Burkhart a question while I got him handy? Are you going to call into the Energy Council webinar on Thursday?
Yes. Thank you, Mr.
Well, I
Chairman.
can't do it because I've got education committee. I'm not going to be able to call in. I just wanted to find out if you were.
Mr. Chairman, yes, I will. Thank you for the brief moment, the privilege.
All right. So Representative McGuire, I'll have you know that the DEQ came and the odor was nothing unusual here, so I don't have to pay a fine or an additional charge. All right. We'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you, folks. Good work. Appreciate it.